Last year, a friend, Julie, and I decided to go backpacking in an NC section of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a relatively remote mountain or trail with a Boy Scouts camp at the base. We were planning on hiking the length of the trail from one side of the mountain to the other, which was supposed to take about 4 days, I think. We drove separately to the mountain, and Julie beat me to the parking area of the trail, which consisted of dirt road right next to a creek. There were 3 other cars parked, including hers. I met up with her, and we started hiking up the approximately 3,000 feet to the summit at around 3 p.m. Now, I'd backpacked 2 times before and camped about 3 times before this. I was pretty young each time, and someone else was in charge of researching the area that we were in, but basically checking the weather for the time that we'd be there and what the camping area was like. But this time, I was the one who had decided where to hike. I didn't look at the weather or what was going on with the trail at the time, just that it looked beautiful and like a fun trek. Well, Julie was quite experienced with backpacking. She used to work for a company that led school kids on Appalachian trail trips and was the reason that I trusted her as my backpacking partner. She had looked up the weather and the status of the trail, and apparently we were in for thunderstorms for the week. On top of that, the accomplice in an unresolved homicide case was last seen on this trail. Stupidly though, I wasn't too put off by this. So, as we hiked up the mountain, we passed what I now know were the owners of the other cars in the parking lot at the base of the trail. A woman and a man who were walking their adorable dog. A man with a fully equipped backpack. I didn't think about it at the time. And another man who had hiking sticks and seemed to be just out for a day hike, I suppose. At around 5 p.m., we were exhausted because the trail was pretty much straight up. We found ourselves in a relatively open area close to the summit and decided to set up camp. Despite the area being cleared, no one was around besides a few campfires that had been there for a while because the last rains had been about a week ago. So we set up our tents, and then we go to find firewood. And well, 20 feet up the mountain from our camp, there was an apparently abandoned tent. We ignored it at first because, well, we didn't want to be rude. Eventually, though, we realized that there was no one else around. I decided to look inside the otherwise pristine tent. The rain fly wasn't on, so I peeked inside one of the ventilation flaps. Inside was a wet sock and 3 Cliff Bar wrappers and an unused condom. Weird, but no one was around, so we ignored it. We ate dinner and tied our bear bag and went to sleep. And as soon as I zipped my tent door closed, rain started to fall. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the most acclimated to sleeping on a flat, hard surface, so my night was characterized by periodic moments of restlessness to readjust. It was pitch black too, so it was difficult to determine whether I was dreaming or awake. During the night, though, I thought I heard 2 people come up the trail from the direction Julie and I had come from. They stopped about 10 feet away from our campsite, whispered to each other, and then one of them walked through our camp. The next morning, I woke up, surprisingly well rested, I must admit. And as we were eating breakfast, I told Julie about my dream. She told me that it couldn't have been a dream, though, because she experienced the same thing. And that was when I noticed the footprints through our camp. Naturally, we went to the location of the mysterious tent from the day before, and it was still there. Well, we continued our hike to the summit in the rain that hadn't stopped from the night before. The summit's portion of the trail was impassable due to overgrowth, so we went back to our cars and we left. And to this day, I've been left wondering why 2 people would hike up 2,900 feet of difficult trail in the pitch blackness of night without flashlights while it's raining, only to walk through our camp. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friends and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths that we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be pretty rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area. and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving home until the sun was up. One particular night, we decided to ride a few miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favourite hidden routes. It began with a narrow paved path that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and was extremely relaxing to ride though due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness, and we both noticed what appeared to be a tiny moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, though, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, though, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the dark and the silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off the path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill overlooking where we'd just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and the darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers right up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers and 2 on full-size motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance that we'd covered. We felt safe enough, though, to whisper softly to each other and speculated who these people could be. Our first thought was that they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times that we'd been, though, and honestly, we doubted that this country had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, though, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. But they called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out there and we can see you, come on out." But we stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell, "Find them now," and smashed a bottle. They had erased any hope that we had that these were just park rangers at this point. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path that we had come from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside the dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and the paths, one of them already coming full circle and passing the point that we started from. I thought about calling for help, but I was too afraid to open my phone in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their farthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and as fast as we could through those woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we would hide again whenever we felt that they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse, though, as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us while basically only being covered in leaves and plants may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, though, we emerged from the woods into the intersection of the 2 main roads, far from where we had started. We ducked down into the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor, who we were supposed to meet up with after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was, and luck was with us again because he hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the 2 streets that we were near the corner of and explained that we needed to be picked up right away. He agreed to speed over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of these men did. We bolted into the backseat of his car, yelling for him to get out of there, and he took off. And relief does not begin to describe what I felt being safely driven home after everything that I had just experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police in the end. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out of there anyway, and that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law by taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people even were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think that we may have walked up to a huge drug deal or something. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started that we couldn't see. Both of our minds went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer stuff, so I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought that we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw ourselves. And so we'll never really know, I suppose. So, this happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I still can't shake off just how terrifying and strange it all was. So I was home alone, getting ready for my 12 o'clock college class that morning, and I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. I glanced out my window, and I saw a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap, roaming around my property, with his hands on his hips, walking with a lot of weird confidence. Now, our yard is kind of like a cliff, and it looks over onto 5 acres of property down below. I live in the PNW, so it's a pretty scenic view. But I was really confused and thought maybe it was a worker that my mum had hired for our renovations on the house, admiring the view or something. I'm a little bit uncomfortable at this point because the dude walks to the side of my house out of sight. I head upstairs, though, to see him now roaming around my front yard and my driveway, looking at things, checking out my house, etc. He still hasn't seen me at this point, though. I call my dad and ask him if we hired anyone to come by the house, and he says not that he knows of, and tells me that he's going to call my mum and ask her, and then call me back. I'm waiting for the call when I notice this strange dude's car. It's a white Honda, but it doesn't have any license plates. Just parked parallel to my front door. The dude still hasn't seen me, and he's still wandering around, so I take this as an opportunity to remember that we have a security system, and I armed it, so if he did break in, it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker, he would ring my doorbell or knock at least once. He did neither, though. And just then I get a call back from my dad saying that neither him or my mum hired anyone to come by today and that I need to call our local police station immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs and called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end what was happening, and she decides that she's not going to send an officer out, and instead gives me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I call the number that she gave me, and immediately I get an automated message saying, "Thanks for calling." Basically, that's it. At this point, I'm really irritated because 15 minutes has passed and this weird dude is still lurking around my house when I'm home alone, and apparently there wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to the lady that I called at my local police department. So I hung up and decided to call 911. After getting in touch with the 911 operator, I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading toward my house. The whole thing seemed just really weird because nobody was in a hurry to have officers come up to my place when I was a younger girl home alone with this strange guy lurking around. I asked the officer if I could stay on the line with her when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted police to come to where I was, and she agreed, and I went back upstairs to check on the weird guy, and he's now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to a radio show extremely loudly or on a phone call with someone through his car. It was a very prominent and loud male voice coming from his car, and then all of a sudden I hear the tone you hear when someone hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked it up, and instead I was greeted by a really creepy heavy breathing. I'm not sure who it was, but it really freaked me out. So I hung up immediately and dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up to this point, but that phone call put me into panic mode immediately. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain it to her, and she said that the cops were on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The dude is still here in his car, and the cops aren't. But keep in mind too that I live in a smaller town, so there is no reason why it took the cops as long as it did to come down. Finally, this dude is leaving my driveway right as the cops pull in, and they stop him and ask him a few questions. The cop then comes to my door and hands me a sketchy-looking flyer saying that it was just a landscaper and he said he had an appointment. I was really relieved and irritated that it was just a dude that my mum had hired, until I realized that it just wasn't. I called my mum back and said that the cop said it was just a landscaper that you hired and that he had an appointment. My mum replies with, "I assure you that we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one." Apparently, according to the police, the guy got a slap on the wrist for not having his license plates on his car, but that was about it. This story happened about 5 years ago when I, female 19, was 14 or so. So me and my friends went through a phase around then where we were obsessed with playing with my Ouija board. We would use it every weekend, sometimes feeling like we were contacting something, but none of us were ever really sure if it was something else moving the planchette. One day, when we were riding our bikes in the trails of the woods near our houses, we found this little shack. Looking back, it was on somebody else's property and was probably just a hangout spot that the owners made, but our first thought was, oh my goodness, how spooky. We peeked inside, and lo and behold, there was a Ouija board and a planchette sitting right on the floor, with a few chairs sitting around it. We discussed taking it, but decided it was pointless since we already had one, and went back home empty-handed. However, a couple of weeks later, we were using my board at a playground at night, and for reasons that I don't remember, decided to leave it hidden in the park and get back to it the next day. But when we came back to get it though, it was missing. Since it was my board and it had been my friend's idea to stash it in the park for the night, I was pretty upset and ordered everyone to get on their bikes and come with me to get the Ouija board that we found in the woods the other week. We went back down the same trail and found it sitting in the same place that we last saw it. That night too, we decided to use our new toy for the first time, inside the shed next to my house. There were 3 of us touching the planchette and another 4 or so standing around holding lights. We started doing our normal intro ritual, asking if anyone was there and who would like to speak to us and such, and I just started to feel extremely lightheaded, as if I was about to faint. I tried to say something, but found that I was unable to speak. Finally, I decided to just stand up to get everyone's attention, and the next thing I remember is standing outside the shed leaning over with my hands on my knees while everyone stared at me in shock. And this is what happened, according to my friends. Allegedly, I stood up and calmly walked outside the shed and started puking rather violently. The vomit was definitely puke, but the colour of it was really dark red and looked a lot like blood. My friends were kind of in shock and asked if I was okay, and that was when I spoke and I said, "Stop playing." They immediately took their hands off the board and everyone ran to me and started yelling and shining lights on me, and before everyone was even out of the shed, I wasn't puking anymore. Ever since then, nothing weird or paranormal has happened in my life like so many other stories, but I've always been a believer before, and especially after that event. I mostly just appreciate the fact that I have a damn good scary story to tell people, and I'm also wondering if anybody can tell me what they think caused that to happen, or if you guys have any similar experiences that you could share. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your stories too. When I lived with an ex and her family, her dad's van was keyed pretty badly, so being an electrician and all, he decided to set up cameras overlooking the street where we parked our cars. The camera was accessible via an app which I had on my iPad, and it would pick up any movements, record it and save it, or alternatively you could watch it live. The house was just around the corner from a pub, so we just assumed it was some drunk person mucking about on their way home or something. Anyway, one Saturday morning I go out to the street to see that all our cars had been keyed. I frantically checked the app and there was an update at 11:30 p.m, but it was just a dog walker. Myself and my girlfriend's dad checked all the updates from the last 24 hours, but there was nothing, which was really strange. We thought that maybe someone could have moved the camera because it was in plain view outside of the house, so my girlfriend's dad moved it to a more subtle position. And from then on, every Friday night for several weeks, we'd have the iPad set up in the living room watching the camera live. But, as is typical with these things, nothing really happened and we soon just lost all interest and pretty much forgot about it. A few months later, I was on my iPad in the house on a Friday night, deleting some apps, when I came across the camera app. Me and my girlfriend shared a joke and decided to watch it live to see if the cars would get keyed again. We were having Chinese food and watching a film and set up the iPad on a table in the corner of the room. At around midnight, my girlfriend had gone to bed and I was watching the end of the film with my dog when something caught my eye on the iPad. I totally forgot that I'd left it running, and I watched the screen as I saw what looked like an old lady walk past the house in the cars, which immediately piqued my attention because what was she doing out at this time, I thought? Something to do with a church maybe that was opposite? Soon though, she disappeared out of shot as she waddled down the street. About 5 minutes later, the movie had finished and I turned all the lights off in the living room. The only light that I had on was the iPad screen. I picked it up and went to turn it off, but stopped when I see something on the screen. It was the old lady again, standing outside the house, just stood perfectly still, staring straight into the camera. What the hell is she doing, I thought. It was actually pretty terrifying. I mean, she must have stood there for a good 2 minutes before reaching one hand into her pocket and pulling an object out and walking over to my car. She then frantically started using the object on the top of the bonnet. Me and my dog then bolted out of the back door. I unlocked the gate and burst out onto the street, ready to catch this old lady, red-handed, but there was nothing. The street was completely empty. No old ladies and just the parked cars outside the house. I even jogged up and down the whole street, but I didn't see anybody. Now, there is just no way that she could have got away in the seconds that it took me to get out of the house like that. Confused, I eventually went to bed, and the next morning I told my girlfriend and her old man all about what happened the previous night. He studied the recordings, and the camera had picked it all up to her walking past originally and her walking away after she had vandalized the car, and me and my dog appearing a split second later on camera. My girlfriend's dad took the recordings to a work colleague in hope that he could enhance the picture quality so that we could see the lady in more detail. It worked, and we got to see her in her full glory, and my girlfriend's mum recognized her. She lived 2 doors down from us and regularly visited the church opposite. We used the recording and reported it to the police, but my girlfriend and I split up soon after that, so I don't really know what happened. I certainly never saw a penny for any of the damage caused to my car, but what still sits with me though is the fact that I can assure you that I never saw that woman when, according to that footage, I should have. So this happened about a month ago, and it's been really bugging me since then. This will be a bit of a long one, but setting up the scene is important. So, my family has a cabin that we've had since the 60s, and I've been going there for pretty much my entire life throughout the years. It's nestled in a little town of less than 2,000 and surrounded in vast forest and farmland. You can see cows everywhere and stray dogs who will let you pat them, and you'll see maybe 30 people in a day if you go to the little town shops and small mum and pop restaurants, but it's basically the definition of a small country town. Since I've been going here my entire life too, I pretty much know everyone. Well, my family knows everyone at least. Men dress in western clothes and big jeans and old flannel shirts and belts with big-ass buckles, and women dress in jeans and tank tops with country factory logos on them. But they're all nice enough, but mostly they just kind of keep to themselves. So, I'm driving up there one night to meet my parents since they'd gone down the night previously to open the cabin for spring. My boyfriend had also flown in so that he could meet my family who lived up there. I'd been driving until it got dark, about a 2-hour and 10-minute drive from my house, and he had taken over driving around 10 p.m. There's also a little national park close by, about 15 miles in total of land, and since I'd fallen asleep and couldn't give directions, he decided to log the address into the GPS. It took him through the back way through the park that I never drive through, so when he woke me up to ask where the next turn was, since the GPS said that he could go either way, it took me a minute to figure out where the hell we were. There were no lights anywhere, and we were the only car for about 15 miles. Long forests with tall, giant trees on either side of the road, with a lonely deer or two in the woods to keep us company. I mentioned switching drivers because I remember that the road, the entrance to the park, would lead directly to the intersection that would go through a small community up to the mountain my cabin was on. But it was prime, leave a toy baby on the side of the road and kidnap someone when they check it out, territory. It was dark enough and the forest was thick enough that we joked about some cult members could be hiding out there or something. Hell, maybe they actually were. Needless to say, though, we decided that stopping was not a good idea. We eventually passed through a small clearing, or intersection, not the one that we wanted, with a dinky concrete building on the side of the road with one light on, and a car pulled in the slanted gravel ground. My boyfriend drives forward, and we see two people there. My gut immediately twisted, and I started to feel sick. Sick enough to feel ice cold run through my veins and needing a hand on my stomach. I mean, you never see people at night here. And it was two kids, teen boys. In fact, probably around 15, I'd say. They were wearing city clothes, Nike shorts, and obnoxiously coloured sports workout clothing, and just looking very out of place. They saw us coming and walked away from what looked like an old beat-up El Camino, probably 1965, I'd say. It's important to note that the paint was completely gone, and it had light brown dirt or rust covering the whole body. They waved and smiled at us, and that was what freaked me out the most. I didn't have a damn clue who these people were, and I knew a gas station that was right up the road, and they could just walk there. I could see it past the road and the overbridge ahead, in fact. That building was also abandoned, so how was there a light on at all? They walked out onto the road, almost blocking us from going forward, and my boyfriend had to slow down not to hit them as they continuously waved their hands and smiled at us. Maybe saying something, but I couldn't hear it. I remember my and my boyfriend's conversation going something like this. Hey, should we stop? He asked, looking nervously at me with a hand on the gear shift. No, absolutely not. Just keep driving, I said, clenching the door handle and double-checking it to be locked. But what if they're actually in trouble? I don't care. I don't know them, and my gut's telling me that we just need to leave. That building is abandoned, and it shouldn't have a light. And hell, their car is abandoned. Just drive, please. And he quickly drove around them and slammed on the gas, trying to calm me down since the whole scene scared me in such a specific and bizarre way. The images of getting out of our car as some stranger got in flew through my head. I looked behind us as we left them, and they stood in the middle of the road with a cross between an angry look and a calm stare, and didn't move from the road until we turned and we couldn't see them anymore. But who were those kids, and why were they wearing city clothes? They looked too young to be driving cars, and I knew for a damn fact that the car they acted like they owned had been there for months. I knew because I remember seeing it last summer when my dad pointed out the model and I said how I wanted one. We finally made it out though and found the intersection that we wanted that led to the familiar gas station, and he didn't hesitate when I said that I needed to drive next. About 10 or so minutes later we get to my cabin, half-heartedly laughing about it the whole way there, and when I told my parents about it, they didn't reprimand us for not stopping. It was almost 12 a.m. by that time, and the night wasn't so bad that those kids would freeze or anything, and they agreed with us the whole situation was terribly weird. Should I have actually stopped? Maybe. Can I change what I did? No. Did I feel comfortable stopping? Absolutely not. I don't know who those two teen boys were, but the whole situation just felt very ominous. So a little context. I just recently moved and live by myself for the first time. I live in a trailer because, well, it's really cheap, but the area is a little on the sketchy side. I've been here for a month now, and nothing too strange has happened. I'll also add that, yeah, I am a bit of an idiot. So, ever since I moved in, I keep hearing these strange sounds around my house, like someone creeping around near the not-so-thick walls of the trailer. There are a lot of stray cats around this area though, so I've pretty much come to ignore them, chalking it up to the cats wandering around. Lately though, I keep hearing sounds near the bathroom window. It's almost like someone dragging a stick along the side of the wall outside. I have blackout curtains on every window and the blinds are always closed, but the bathroom only has a sheer white curtain and the window is that mottled textured glass that just gives a mosaic view if you look in. I'm equal parts dumb and cowardly, so I never peep out the windows when I hear these weird noises. About a week ago, someone started banging on my door though, and this was like banging frantically. And this is where me being a dumbass factors in. I debate answering the door, but then the banging suddenly stops. My stupid curiosity gets the better of me, and I open the door and see a skinny man in dark clothes. It's 7 p.m. and the sun is almost completely set, so I can't make out his features. And he's just standing there, turned back looking at me. I ask, "Did you need something?" He stared in my direction for maybe a solid 10 seconds and then just walked a few unsteady steps away. Then he turned back and looked at me and pointed up at the sky wordlessly. Then he turned his head up to the sky and stared up for a while, then gave me one last look and turned away and meandered unsteadily down the unlit street. I closed and locked my door, confused about the encounter. I had continued hearing the weird sounds outside my house and actually started trying to glimpse through the sides of the curtains to find the cause, but still not courageous enough to actually draw them back and look right out. Just about an hour ago, I heard the strange noise again in my bathroom and then listened to it slowly travel to my bedroom window. My bathroom is connected to my room. The sound abruptly stopped for a time, then I heard it very slowly scrape against the wall back to the bathroom and it was gone again. This whole situation is actually starting to freak me out a little bit now, but of course it could always just be the cats and I could be overreacting. But then again, I don't know who that man was or what he's doing around my house when these weird noises are happening. So this happened a few months ago in the McDonald's at Copenhagen Station. I'm not Danish, only visiting the country for one day, and since I wanted to travel cheap, I decided to take the cheapest bus there, which just so happened to be the one arriving at 11 p.m. the day before. I thought that I could save even more money by not renting a bed somewhere and instead spending the night awake, or half asleep, at the station, do my business the next day, and sleep long and well on the bus back home. So, this McDonald's is open 24/7. I pretty early discovered that the station was too cold for me to get some shut-eye, so I went inside and bought a coffee and sat down at the empty table. Plenty of lighting and semi-drunk people to keep me awake, I thought. I should add that I'm 23 and female, and after a while of sitting in my spot, a strange guy walked over and placed a full cup of soda on my table. He said in Danish something that I believe meant, "I ate my food already, I didn't drink any, you should have it instead." I'm Swedish, and although some Swedes understand Danish perfectly well, I have some difficulties doing so this is just a bit of a guess. Anyway, I didn't really pay much attention to the cup after it was put on the table. Just wrote it off as a random drunk trying to flirt. But I noticed that in front of me, a table away, sat another guy, and he was watching me closely because we did lock eyes the times that I looked up to peek at him. And this kind of creeped me out a bit. I really didn't like being watched like this, and he just kind of sat there for nearly an hour, even though he had no food in front of him. In the end, this dude stood up and walked over to me, and I cursed internally, thinking that I'd have to defend myself and tell him to leave. But he turned, and there stood the guy that had left the soda cup on my table. He told the soda guy to leave after pushing the soda cup back into his arms, and that he didn't want to see him anywhere near this place again. Then he turned to me and explained, in English mind you, that Soda Guy had walked by my table several times glancing at me and the cup, and probably was waiting for me to drink it. He said that he'd finished his meal a while ago and just stayed to watch over me, but had to leave, and reminded me to be careful. To be honest too, I hadn't even noticed Soda Guy supposedly pacing by. I was too fixated on this other dude who just happened to be the good guy watching over me. And I often wonder just what was in that soda, and what would have happened should I have gotten really thirsty and drank some of it. I can still remember this day like it was yesterday, my mother's words clinging to my eardrums like plastic wrap on a leftovers plate. She said, "I need you and your friends to be extra careful. There have been reports of a white truck following little girls home. If you see your friends walking alone, don't let them. You walk with them until they get there, and do not leave them until they reach their front door." To ease a worry, I began walking with everyone to school and back home. It took me longer to get home, but I had the safest location on my street. At that time, my house could see into all the surrounding parks and school playgrounds and sat at the top of the hill as well. It was also next door to both the mayor of the housing authority and the SFC, Sergeant First Class of the military police. In my mother's defense too, she was a single mum of 4 and was active duty. I didn't get the luxury of getting rides to school when typically she was out of home at 5 a.m. and didn't return until 5 p.m. Even in the summer, school started at 8 a.m. and ended at 3 p.m. and you could only take a bus to school if you lived more than 3 miles from campus. In case you didn't know too, the military is a full-time job. Regardless of your home situation or your kids, when you get orders, you follow them or risk demotions or being dishonorably discharged. So, I did the same routine every day, go across the street, through the 2 houses, down to the sidewalk, go through an alleyway until I reach Tank Destroyer Trail, walk half a mile to the concrete bridge that goes over the street, and finally down the other side to the school side doors. Reverse order, repeat every year for 3 years. So my mother was a drill sergeant, and until that morning I had never really taken her word seriously. I remember telling her, "We live on a military base, Mum. There's no way that I'll go missing, and besides, I'll just scream." It's summer in Central Texas. It's a blistering hot day, and summer school has been dismissed early. Me and a few of my friends are walking home together, but today it's just eerily quiet between us. My gut is buzzing like an angry hive the further away we get from the school, and for whatever reason, I felt like I was just being watched. I do a scan of the area and notice that there are no other students around but myself, Aubrey, Ashley, and Amber. Nothing is being said as we get halfway across the bridge, so I break the silence and ask if they're okay. Ashley responds, "My mum and dad have been warning me about this truck that's following kids home." Aubrey chimes in and says, "Mine too. I think they're just trying to scare us." "But why?" I ask. "What purpose would that serve them to do that?" "Maybe to keep tabs on us," Aubrey replied while looking at her phone. Aubrey's dad was a bit of a control freak, but I doubt that even he would have done something that drastic to control her. If that was the case, then there would be no need for all of our parents to warn us too. "Well, I'm going to go home this way today, guys," Ashley says as she starts to take a different route home. "Wait, but what about the truck?" Amber grabs Ashley's hand and grips it tightly. "You need to stay with us." I look over at Aubrey, who's walking a bit faster down the trail. I can hear the fear in her voice. "I'm getting out of here before something bad happens, okay?" My hair practically jumps off my body hearing her say those words. All of the danger bells and whistles are going off so loudly that I can barely hear myself talk. "Ashley, at least let us walk you there," I pleaded, and she reluctantly agrees and comes back to the trail with us. Aubrey is a good length ahead of us, and so we yell for her to slow down. She turns around, and I can see the whites of her eyes. I turn just slightly to my right, and from the corner of my eye, there's an all-white truck there. No license plate and a tinted front window so you couldn't see the driver. It was slowly driving by the curb on the main road, and it was definitely following us. There were no other cars around too, and that made it even more creepy. I stopped walking and looked back at the truck. I tried to see if I could make out any distinctive marks, a make or a model, but it didn't even have a brand on it. Ford, Chevy, Nissan, and no grill emblem at all. My friend stopped and then we all stared. Whoever was in the driver's seat was certainly looking back at us too, and all of us held our breaths and waited for it to leave. But It didn't. My every sense was telling me to run. My gut was telling me to run. My fight or flight was only flight at that point. I already knew what was going to come next, so I placed my leg behind me, and as I took a step back, I said, "It's going to chase us, and we need to run." Before the others could respond, the engine of the truck roared like a lion. The front tires jumped the curb, and the truck came barreling down the trail. That half a mile seemed to take forever to run down. We bolted down the trail as fast as we could. It definitely was gaining on us, though. We get to the end of the trail and stopped at the sidewalk, and that's by my neighborhood street, and it was still chasing us. We all shouted and screamed, and Aubrey tried to get her cell phone and dial 911, but dropped it as we were running. But where was everyone? How was no one hearing us cry out? Behind all of these houses? Whose backyard leads to the walking trail? And how was that even possible that they didn't hear us? Is no one seeing this? I tell them all to follow me to my house, and we finally get there. My front door is locked, and I don't have my house key, but we immediately go next door to the MP officer's house and begin hurling our fists at the door, screaming for help. The officer isn't home, but luckily, his wife is. She opens the door, and we frantically get inside. We force her out of the way, and we all run inside and we slam the door shut. Miss Janet is asking us all kinds of questions, but we quickly tell her to be quiet. But we don't even make it to the couch, and we all stand by the door and try to stay away from the windows. We hear the truck drive by and decide that no one leaves until Miss Janet's husband comes home. Just thinking about this too as I'm sharing this, it makes my stomach turn in knots, even 11 years later. When he eventually comes home, though, we make a formal police report and tell our parents, our teachers, and other students about the incident, but we never heard any other updates on the truck. But from then on, teachers were on every post at the trail for kids walking home from school, and MPs were and still are posted on every corner within a 2-mile radius of the school. So my two friends and I were hiking in a national park one day. We decided to hike the trail, which had much less traffic, and arrived early in the morning. An older man, dressed in shorts, hiking boots, a shirt, sun hat, and carried a walking stick, overheard us talking about stuff and decided to get up from the rock that he was sitting on and join us on the rest of our hike. Long story short, we arrived at the entrance of a cave. The older man stayed back while my friends and I explored it. It was really narrow, but opened up to somewhat of a belly room, but one way in and one way out. We came back and greeted the man, and he then told us that he wanted to explore it as well. We told him that we would wait for him at the entrance. Mind you, this cave isn't very deep. We were in there for a total of 5 minutes, I'd say, and after waiting for him for 15 minutes, we decided that we should go and check out that he's safe. But when we got into the cave, he was gone. The only thing left was his walking stick sitting in the center of the cave. We called his name and even climbed up into a crevice to see if he had somehow gotten stuck or something, but he just wasn't there. We never found him either, and it was the creepiest thing that I've ever experienced. So I'm telling you this in the hopes of being able to share my experiences without too much judgment. I know not everyone will believe me, and I'm prepared for that. But I also know that there are many who are remaining silent and who can actually relate. So I'll begin with my first journal entries. I am also hopeful that one day I can find the courage to open all of my journals to the world and share some of my most terrifying experiences with the paranormal. But for now, I'll start with this. So, I know we live in a world full of skeptics who are ready to write me off as crazy. I have 32 years of unexplained experiences, entities, feelings, and a judgment, all of which I documented in multiple journals. Early in my journey, I wanted to actually prove skeptics wrong, but now I just want them to be open to the idea that this is not a black and white world. There is so much grey, and although sometimes it's terrifying, it can change someone's entire perspective. I want to belong to a group of like-minded individuals who see and live in the greyness of the world. There was a point in my life, too, that I was very vocal about things that I'd experienced. I didn't fear people thinking that I was crazy, and I was adamant about changing a skeptic's mind. In my reality, I didn't understand how or why a person could be a skeptic. My first memories as a child involved an imaginary friend. It was my form of normal. Now looking back though, I know the things that I experienced were definitely not normal, and that I had that so-called sixth sense and was extremely sensitive to things that other people were not. I have experienced things that others only experience by watching fictional horror movies. But I can tell you that I lived in a real horror movie. So as I mentioned, at a very early age I would see different entities around my house. My parents blamed it on an active imagination, but it was real. At that time we lived in a very old house with an additional guest house attached. We just used the guest house as a storage, and we never had occupants, and my father was an auctioneer and was constantly bringing home old antiques. One day, my father brought home a green recliner to go in my room for my mother to read to me at night. However, an older gentleman with a black beard and hat occupied the chair every night after my mother would leave. He would just sit there, appearing more as a silhouette or a shadow. He never spoke and he never moved. He just sat there and just kind of watched me. I strongly believe fear is not something someone is born with, but instead comes from experiences. And this figure, it honestly terrified me because even as a child I knew he was not supposed to be there, and I couldn't understand why my parents couldn't see him. I wish that he was the only entity in my house, but he wasn't. There was a long hallway that separated my room from the guest bedroom and the stairs. I would always see a shadow figure walking this hallway and going into the guest bedroom. It wasn't the man in the chair. This thing was much scarier. Its energy was strong and extremely negative, and the feeling that I spoke about earlier originated in this hallway. Whether it was visible or not, I always knew it was around too. I would run from the stairs to my room every single day, and then the entity began to move around the house. I think one of the more terrifying things that happened was when I was around 10. I was getting ready in front of a mirror hanging on the bathroom door, and there was a belt on the ground next to me partially under the door, and I remember vividly looking into the mirror and seeing the belt slowly slide farther under the door. Thinking that I was being pranked, I opened the bathroom door and no one was there. However, the belt was now on the bathroom floor. And not only was the house leaving me in a constant state of fear and anxiety, but the guest house was a place that I physically could not go into because of all the dreadful feelings that it gave. The few times I did go into the guest house, though, I would always feel like I was going to be sick and would immediately leave. The guest house was a small house with a large attic. There was a big window in the attic that looked over the entire property. And one afternoon, I was jumping on the trampoline with my friends. I believe this is kind of the epiphany moment in my life too, when I realized that I was not the only person experiencing these things. My friend looked up at the window with a terrified look on his face and said there was a woman dressed in white looking down at us. I looked up and she had long blonde hair and had a very blank expression on her face. We watched her for a few minutes and then she just disappeared. The house was definitely empty though, and the stairs to the attic had not been used in years. In other words, this lady didn't simply walk away from the window, she just completely vanished. I had 3 friends that day that witnessed this entity disappearing into thin air as well, and this was a validation to me that I was not crazy and that there are things in this world that just can't be explained. I lived in that house until I was 12 years old. The level of activity increased throughout the years to the point that I began documenting them in a journal. I have specific details of each experience, far too many to write down here in one post. But when I moved out to our new house, built specifically for my family, I thought that things would stop and I could just be a normal kid. But boy, was I just so wrong about that. So this was around 7 to 8 years ago. We were getting insulation for our small attic space that was directly linked to my room with a door. We had a small house. We had never opened this area since we moved in too, and I was sitting down on my bed when my parents opened the door and immediately just everything went wrong. My lights blew, 3 of them in one lamp and one in a separate lamp plugged into a different surge protector than the first. so I'm pretty sure that it wasn't a freak electrical coincidence. My parents stopped what they were doing and went downstairs to check the breakers. I was still sitting on my bed and the only light was coming in from the hallway. My door was open a little bit so I could see maybe a fourth of the room or something, when I heard more or less a growling sound from the attic, and it honestly scared the crap out of me because I thought there could have been a raccoon or something down there. I didn't move because I didn't want to spook it or anything. It kept going for a few minutes, and then I heard ridiculously loud footsteps, like someone stomping with all their might on the ground. And then I saw what was making the sounds. A maybe 7 or 8 foot tall person's shadow that was mostly defined, but not detailed, walked out of the doorway, still making the massive footstep sounds, made a gesture which I can only assume was a come with me wave toward itself, and walked back through the doorway. I waited a few seconds after it was gone, shut the door immediately, and then my lights came back on. This all happened in the span of maybe 10 or so minutes, so when my parents came back up, I told them about what happened, and they said that they didn't hear anything. And honestly, I have no clue what happened to this day. I don't think I'm schizophrenic or anything, and I wasn't asleep, so it's not like it was sleep paralysis or anything. I'm still skeptical of everything paranormal, even after this, because the whole event just seems so horror movie-ish that I can't believe that it was real. I grew up on a cattle ranch in southwest Texas, close to Rio Grande. It's a mountainous area with a semi-arid climate. It has a strange kind of beauty that all deserts tend to have, I suppose. Riding through the hills on a horse can be difficult in the heat during the day, but at night, the sky is clear and the view is amazing. Getting distracted for too long, however, can send you and your horse off the side of a cliff and plummeting onto the rocks below. Now, my family is Mexican-American, and living so close to the border, there's no shortage of myths and legends, ranging from witches to Apache ghosts to La Llorona, and my parents are religious, but they're of the belief that superstitions are just sinful. So they raised me a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. Furthermore, spending most of my life outdoors made me chalk up most people's stories to just local wildlife, which, for some reason, God decided should act in the freakiest ways possible at night. Long story short, I didn't believe in ghosts. There are, however, things that I can't just explain this way, and have definitely had some strange experiences of my own. Our ranch was near Marfa too, where the famous Marfa lights phenomenon occurs. That whole town gives off just an eerie feeling in general too, especially at night. Nowadays, it's home to artists and other not-so-normal people drawn to the town for this reason. My story, however, begins when I was rounding up some of my dad's Red Angus cattle so we could send them to the feedlot in the morning. This kind of work can last all the way into the evening, especially in those hills. By the time I got home, the sky had turned pink and the moon was in the sky, seemingly watching the sunset. After closing all the pens, I rode my horse to the barn, which was all the way down the hill from the cattle pens. To get there, I had to go through a gate and follow a path to a large mesquite tree, and the barn was just past the tree. Halfway down the hill, my horse just stopped and perked his ears up, looking straight at the tree itself. I kicked him forward, but he kept trying to back up the hill or side pass to the left. Now, the path that we were on had a drop to the side, so if my horse kept going sideways, we'd eventually both fall right off, so I tried to keep him straight. The more I pressed him, however, the more irritated he got. He had his ears pinned back and began stomping his feet. This was really unusual for him too. It was fairly dark at this point, so I assumed that he could see something that I couldn't and simply coaxed him all the way down the hill so that we could just ride around the tree without worrying about falling, being cautious just in case there was a predator in the darkness. We finally got to the door of the barn and I dismounted and began unsaddling when suddenly I just got this really uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. My horse had settled down already and I was now able to focus on the unnatural stillness around me. There were no crickets, none of the chickens were making any noise, and the whole atmosphere just felt really menacing. I looked up from behind my horse at the tree, and right there, in the darkness, I could see what looked like a fox start behind the tree to the back of the barn. I quickly unsaddled and then tied my horse to the grill guard of my truck, which was parked in front of the barn. I took my rifle so that I could shoot the critter if I saw it. I didn't want it to get to the chickens. I went around to the barn and checked the chicken coop and found nothing. The chickens were all quiet, but they were okay. I assumed that I must have scared it off, but I decided I'd sleep outside for the night in case it came back. When I came back to untie my horse, he was stomping at the ground again and jerking his head around. I untied his rope and led him to his pen, after which I continued to search for the fox, or what I thought was a fox anyway. As I searched, I realized there were no paw prints or any kind of trail that would indicate another animal had even been there. I eventually started to believe that I had just imagined it. Still, I searched a little while longer and found nothing, so I decided I'd be able to sleep inside. Feeling reassured, I fed my horse and closed the barn door before heading in for the night. As I walked back to the house, however, I got that feeling again, this time accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. I don't know why, but I just felt the need to look in the direction of my truck, and when I looked, my blood ran cold. Behind my truck, there looked to be a head peeking out at me. But the dying light from the sun just barely allowed me to make out its features. It was bald, had pale leathery skin, and its features looked like they'd been carved in like a statue or something. It looked like it was glaring at me too. I don't know what it was that kept my feet glued to the ground, but I wanted to run, but I simply couldn't. I stared at this thing for what seemed like forever when suddenly it just vanished. I didn't see it run or even move back behind the truck. It just seemed to almost delete itself from where it was. I was finally able to break my trance, but instead of wanting to run, I simply felt the urge to walk. Like if I ran, I'd be giving an invitation to whatever this thing was to come back and chase me. So I walked back, watching my back, almost like you do when you come across an aggressive dog. And that night, I couldn't sleep for the life of me. I felt hypervigilant. Any movement or small noise was enough to keep me alert and ensure that I wouldn't be able to close my eyes. That night and the next few nights afterward, however, something just kept telling me that I was in danger. I'm not sure what that thing was, but apparently it wasn't the only one. My cousin, Ray, looked horrified when I told him about it, and told me that he'd seen something similar one night when he got back from town. He'd said that he'd seen it more closely, and said that he thought it was one of our German shepherds running around at first. He said that the movements looked off, however, and the dog looked more like it was walking really, really fast. The way that he described it was that it was running like Scooby-Doo, and when he got out of his truck, he felt inexplicably sick to his stomach and felt compulsed to just look behind him. When he looked, he saw that thing standing there in the middle of the dirt road to the entrance of the ranch. It was slender and had pale skin. Its arms were bony and looked kind of jagged. Its facial features were just as I described them. It glared at him for a while before just turning back and jumping off the edge of the hill. He told me of the overwhelming fear that he'd had for the next week after witnessing it, even having a panic attack one day that he was worried that he'd have to ride his horse back in the dark. Neither of us have ever seen it again, but we think my dad may have encountered it in the mountains one night that we spent out there. My dad told us that he was woken up by the sound of an animal outside of his camp. He then heard a voice, my voice, saying, "Hey Dad." It sounded wrong though, is the way that he described it. And when it talked, he noticed just how identical it sounded each time, kind of like a recording. He then noticed just how quiet the night was, the same deafening silence that I'd experienced, and my dad felt this sense of just impending doom and refused to get out of his tent, holding on to his .30-30 Winchester and saying a prayer when, all of a sudden, he heard his mare squeal and kick at something, followed by the sound of a branch breaking and hooves running away. Even then, though, my dad stayed inside and told himself not to get out, no matter what. He says that a few minutes after he heard his horse run off, that he heard what sounded like an unnatural scream off in the distance. He heard it once, then twice, and then everything just went back to normal. The next morning, he saw his horse loping back to him as he got out of his tent. He felt relieved until he noticed how frightened she was. When he tried petting her, she'd back up and snort at him, and furthermore, it took a full hour for him to manage putting the saddle on her, and a long ritual to get himself mounted on her with her taking off at a gallop. What's more, too, is that we'd all noticed that the horse just hadn't been the same for a while. She had been the most well-behaved horse on the ranch before, and my dad even boasted about how broke she was all the time. And she definitely was broke as all get out. Since then, however, she started kicking at anything that came up behind her unexpectedly. She'd been spooking at any noises that sounded wrong, and couldn't be away from another horse when we were all out on the trail. It was a conversation about this changed behavior that led to my dad telling us this story after she'd broken a leg and we unfortunately had to put her down. It wasn't a good way for her to go, but at least she's at peace. Also, my dad's not one to show emotions, but he seemed genuinely disturbed and even fearful. None of us had ever believed in ghosts or witches or cryptids, but this experience has made us a little more open to the possibilities, I suppose. We eventually sold that land and moved in favor of the money the oil field has to offer. Since the move, I've gained access to high-speed internet and have done some digging too. I heard about skinwalkers from an Indian friend of mine, but it had never crossed my mind until I read about them and heard some stories on YouTube and realized just how similar it was. I'm not fully convinced though, and it could be something else entirely, I know that for sure. Either way though, I hope you found this interesting and be safe out there. My mum recently shared a strange and creepy experience that she and her siblings and parents witnessed when she was younger at around 6 years of age. My mum is a very elegant, classy, prim and proper woman who would not be the type of person to lie about this just to scare someone. Also, my aunts and uncles have verified this story individually, so I believe that it's true. So my grandparents, mothers, aunts and uncles temporarily lived in a small village or town in Mexico with a population of about 1,000 people scattered throughout the hilly landscape. They lived at the bottom of one of the larger hills that could take a couple of hours to hike to the very top of. My grandparents were relatively poor, my grandmother making just enough to provide for the necessities by working at a sugarcane field, but yet they lived in one of the nicer homes because of its proximity to the hill and an alleged witch's house at the top of that hill. Locals stayed away from that house, and rent was cheapest there out of all the other much simpler homes available. My grandparents, aunts, uncles, and mum had some paranormal experiences in that home too. Most of these were attributed to the witch in typical Mexican folklore fashion. The skinwalker they witnessed, however, that was what made them leave in the end. So, my mum says that one day she was inside at the entrance of the home with the door wide open playing with some toys. My aunts and uncles were in the same room behind her, also playing and roughhousing while my grandfather was relaxing in a rocking chair in that room. She just so happened to look up right as a medium-sized black dog was walking along the road in front of the home. And what spooked her about this dog is that the dog looked like it had 2 human breasts hanging from its chest that were connected to its skin as though it was a part of its body. She says that the breasts were hairless, which allowed her to see that they were indeed human and not some sort of tumor growth on the dog or something. My mum says that the dog instantly gave her very bad feelings and she started to cry. This caused the dog to stop in its tracks and look at my mum. My grandfather got up and headed towards the door, as did my aunts and uncles, to see what was going on. He instantly recognized what the creature was and pulled out a small revolver that he always carried with him due to the long treks that he made on foot to his job. He aimed the revolver and tried pulling the trigger, but the gun just kept jamming and wouldn't fire. He tried it multiple times, each time checking and making sure the gun was in proper working order, but it simply just wouldn't fire. And all the while, the dog was just standing there watching. The dog eventually turned and started running down the road into some overgrowth along the side of the road. After it disappeared from view, my grandfather tried shooting his gun and it fired without a hitch. Although they were very limited financial-wise, they moved out within a week after that encounter. Unfortunately, both of my grandparents passed when I was really young, so I can't actually ask them about this event. I've never heard of a skinwalker partially changing and turning like this, and so I found this quite interesting. And I hope you guys did too. 6 months ago, I moved in with my fiancée. The house isn't old per se, but it was built in the 60s, and we've never found any history on it or the land that it's on. I am working on getting old deeds currently, but we live in North Georgia, in an area where Native American heritage is a very big part of the history of the land, along with the Civil War. So, his father is the landlord. He used to rent it out until he decided it was too much work and let us use it until we buy a home. There have been no recent updates or renovations in the home, at least in the last 4 years that it hasn't been rented to tenants. My fiancé always claimed that the house felt weird, and he mentioned on and off that he thought it could be haunted, but he's more of a skeptic about things like that, whereas I'm more open to believing. In the first 3 months, we had no issues. And personally, nothing unexplainable happened or anything that made me feel weird or uncomfortable. Around late December or early January, I started noticing little instances like my car keys weren't where I thought I put them. His wallet and car keys would be in different places around the house, phone chargers randomly being unplugged, dog food bowls moving even though the dog would be outside all day in the yard, and at first I just boiled it down to us being forgetful or running out of the door and yanking phones off of chargers and causing them to pull from the walls, or the dog playing with her stuff before we put her out for the day, and just stuff like that. Everything had an explanation, I guess, because, well, we didn't want to be spooked in our own home, and the explanation still seemed reasonable until the mascara incident. Around the time of the mascara incident, my fiancé, we'll call him F to shorten things, started complaining about having sleep paralysis problems. Having sleep paralysis before, I knew that that's a terrifying thing to have happen, so I told him to maybe cut back on caffeine before bed, and food too. Because at the time it wasn't happening enough to be a concern, and he has a stressful job driving for a well-known company and working from early in the morning to late in the evening most weekdays, and it can mess with you. He had also been getting over the flu, during which for 2 to 3 nights in a row he would wake me up asking me to tell my friend in the corner to leave. I couldn't see who he was talking about, but again he was on so much medicine and spiked high fevers that I thought it could be why. But never once did it occur to me that it might actually be something more, because everything happening was so minor, but I must admit too that it did creep me out a bit and make me a little more aware of what was going on. So, one evening I was getting ready and putting makeup on in the bathroom, only a 1-bath house, so kind of a small space. F was in the shower behind me, and we were talking as usual. He obviously never left the bathroom, and I hadn't needed to or did for any reason. I pulled my mascara out and laid it on the bowl of the sink, can't roll anywhere, to use in a few minutes, and I vocally told F about the mascara in the sink before he jumped out and maybe turned on the faucet to brush his teeth or something. And in the span of maybe 5 minutes, I'd say, I looked down to get my mascara and it was gone, right from in front of me. Now, I hadn't moved it, and I had clearly remembered putting it in the bowl and hearing the clink. He gets out, and we both search all over the bathroom for this mascara. I was beyond frustrated with myself, thinking that I forgot moving it or knocking it out somehow and not hearing it or feeling it. But we didn't find it. That was in February, and it's now April. I had forgotten all about the mascara until I came home a few days ago and went to get ready for a shower, walked into the bedroom, and there on my bed was the mascara that I had lost. I was like, someone just sat it on the bed for me to find. That must have been it. So I called F asking if he had come home that day. He leaves for work every morning an hour before me, and if he had been the one to find the mascara. And he swore up and down that he hadn't been home and had no idea what I was talking about. I made the bed that morning too, and I know that the mascara was not there. And nobody had access to our home at any point that day, but we only have the 1 set of keys anyway. And between February and now, things have escalated too. F has sleep paralysis multiple times a week, and every time, he describes the same thing, which is a girl standing at either the foot of our bed or in the corner of the room, same corner he complained about while sick, with shoulder-length black hair and a dress, but he can't see her face, but he knows somehow that she's watching us. I hadn't had anything more than the mascara thing happen until yesterday evening. To describe the house's layout better, when you walk in the side door from the carport, we never use the front door except for deliveries, it's an open floor plan. The living room and the kitchen are both there together, nothing separates them. The back door is next to the fridge, but we have a small hallway from the living room area that has the washer, dryer, pantry, and coat closet. Both sit across from each other, and from the hall is the 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. You turn left to get to the bathroom, which is kind of tucked in the corner that you can't see from the doorway from the hall until you walk by it. The first room you can actually see to the left is ours, right of the bathroom. Then there's the 2 spare beds, one that's right next to ours, and one tucked off to the right corner directly across from the bathroom. I just washed sheets and was pulling them out of the dryer to fold. I was focused on the laundry, not really paying attention to anything else, so I can't really say if I had felt anything leading up to this, but I pulled everything into my arms and went to turn towards the bedroom. And there, standing in the doorway to the spare room next to ours, was someone. I only saw it for a split second. It caught me so off guard that I dropped everything that I was holding. I can't really tell you the details too, because again it was just a split second, but I promise that something was in that doorway. It just disappeared after my reaction, but it was there and then it was gone. I ran to let the dog out, who absolutely refused to come down the hallway. I tempted her with treats and food and toys for an hour solid, but she just sat at the beginning of the hallway watching the bedroom. When she finally came to the room where I was folding things, she dramatically went around the area of the door to the spare room, watching it like she was watching something and didn't want it to touch her. I've also felt watched since then too. Every little thing that I do, I expect to turn around and someone to be standing there. I don't know if I'm just paranoid from yesterday, but I know what I saw. F fully believed me too. I don't know if he was convinced because of his sleep paralysis or if he could just tell how shaken up I was by the whole thing, but that's been the first time that I've seen her, if it was even her. But I have a gut feeling that it was the same thing that F has been seeing too. Other instances we've had is the dog watching the corner of the room, same corner mind you, barking and growling at nothing and acting like someone is in her way. Plus her food bowl's moving. I've watched shadows under our door numerous nights, like someone walking by, but always chalked it up to possible car lights playing on the shadows from the living room windows or something. I don't feel like this thing is evil, but I also don't feel like this thing really likes us either. Or it's just having fun scaring us or something, like a poltergeist, but if it was a poltergeist, I don't think that we would be able to actually see figures or shadows, right? It's to the point now, though, that we're wanting to move sooner than later, but it's just not in the books for us to buy at the moment, and finding a new rental is tough with a dog as big as ours. So, should I burn sage? Is there anything else that I can do to lift this eerie feeling without angering anything? Also, I almost feel like it could be attached to him, but why show itself to me after having nothing much to do with me, other than move my things for so long? Is anyone having anything similar happen to them? So I grew up in Ohio, but would spend my summer breaks visiting my dad, who lived in England. This gave me the rare and unfortunate opportunity to see a lot of Europe during my teenage years. In the summer of 2009, I took a trip with my father and stepmother, with one of the stops being Graz, Austria. After a day of sightseeing, we checked into our hotel, which was just outside of the city. Graz sits at the foot of the Alps, and our hotel was elevated, which gave us a nice view of the city at night, depending on your vantage point. This also made it somewhat secluded on a darker back road. The hotel was also unique in that parts of it were kind of broken up into separate cabin-like B&Bs. So, my father and stepmother stayed down the street in one of these cabins, while I had my own room in the main building, which was more like your standard pub kind of building. While a lot of these details may seem like minutiae, its layout and location will come up again later. It's also important to note that my room sat over the hotel's restaurant, so the roof extended out from under my window. If I wanted to, I would have been able to step out and walk across it, in fact. So we were only staying there one night before moving on with our trip. It was warm being on the second floor, so I had one of my 2 windows cracked to let in the breeze. The only English-speaking channels were CNN and MTV, so I just laid there with the lights off, the only glow coming from the TV. As I began to doze, I heard something though. It sounded like gravel shifting, maybe, coming from outside. Already being a paranoid person, I turned the TV off, making my room completely black. I slowly moved towards the window, telling myself that I'd just heard a small animal or something like that. I crouched behind the translucent curtains and peered out. Out on the roof, maybe 20 to 30 feet away, I'd say, I saw a man, and he was standing upright, facing out towards the city and back patio of the hotel. My nerves settled as I figured that it's someone who had the same idea that I did. He had probably climbed out one of the rooms next to mine to get a view of the city, so it was no big deal. I slowly started to step away from the window when I heard the sound again. And again, it sounded like gravel shifting, but this time I could tell that it wasn't coming from the man standing at a distance. It was coming from right by my window. I was lucky to have the curtains that I did, as they allowed me to see out, but with the lights off, I was shielded from sight. I came back to the window and looked down to my right, and crouching down there was a man. He had a hood up and what looked like some kind of blank white mask on. I understand now that maybe this was my mind exaggerating the memory, but that white plain face is burned into my brain. Think something like the movie Hush or The Court of Owls if you're a Batman fan. Either way, it was clear that he was trying to peer into my room but couldn't see me because I was blocked by my curtains. I stood there, staring at him for a few seconds before leaning in and banging my hand on the window. And he took off, as did the man on the ledge. And it's clear now that the other guy was most definitely a lookout. After shutting and locking the window, I went down to the lobby and found the manager of the hotel. He barely spoke any English, so explaining what had happened was pretty hard, but once he finally understood what I was saying, he dismissed it, repeating impossible multiple times. I thought about going down the street to my parents' cabin, but the idea of running down a dark road after what had happened did not sound appealing at all. And so, for the rest of the night, I slept with a Heineken bottle from the mini-fridge clutched in my hand. The next morning, I looked over the building and the roof, trying to understand their escape plan. And I still have no idea, as the only way off was to leap from the roof to the ground. But doing so would have been disruptive and maybe even injured them. They went in the opposite directions too, which was really confusing. I'm under the impression that they were staying in another room and had simply darted back into a window, but that still doesn't explain where the second guy went. As we were leaving the hotel, a family friend who lived in Graz came to meet us for breakfast. After explaining what had happened, he nonchalantly affirmed that they had intended to rob me. While I tell myself that they were probably just hoping to simply steal from a tourist while he slept, another voice wonders just how bad it could have actually gone. For Christmas one year, I'd been given a baby doll that you could put batteries into the back of, and it would cry sometimes and you would have to hug it, which really you just press a button on its stomach so that it would shut up. The doll was really annoying, and I only put up with it for a day or two before I had enough of it and took the batteries out. The only way to get it to stop is there was no off switch. I still liked the doll itself though, and played with it like a regular baby doll, and as with most of my toys, it ended up in a pile on the floor. I shared a room with my older sister, 5 years my senior, and one night we woke up to hear the baby doll crying. My sister yelled at me to try and turn the stupid toy off, and in my sleepy little kid brain, I forgot that I took the batteries out, so I pressed the button to hug it, and it just wouldn't stop crying. After several tries, I became frustrated and ripped her dress off and took the battery cover off, only to discover that there were no batteries. My sister was really annoyed at this point and asked me why I hadn't turned it off yet. I told her that it wouldn't turn off, and she said, just take out the batteries. When I told her that there weren't any batteries in the doll, she paused for a moment and said, "What do you mean there are no batteries? That's not possible." I told her that if she didn't believe me to turn on the light next to her. She did, and the moment the light came on, the doll stopped crying. We both looked at each other and screamed, and this woke my mum, dad, and older brother up, and they all rushed into our room. When we told them what happened, they, of course, didn't believe us and told us to not scare each other and go to bed. Well, we turn off the lights, and just as we're about to go back to sleep, yep, you guessed it, the doll started crying again. My sister, fed up at this point, climbed down from her top bunk, opened her bedroom window, and threw the doll out onto the concrete below. The doll never made another sound again, but I wish that was the end of the weird electrical issues in my house and paranormal experiences, but it wasn't. One of the weirdest things to happen was when I was about 16. My brother was 26 and moved out on his own, and my parents divorced when I was 8, and I lived with my mum and older sister. My sister moved into my brother's old room, giving me a room to myself. My mother is a massage therapist, and after some drama with a landlord who was subleasing a building he wasn't supposed to and just pocketing the rent money his tenants were paying, she had to move her office into our dining room. She set up a radio to play soothing spa music for her clients when they came over. For a few weeks, I would come home from school and the radio would be on pretty loud. The first time I turned it off, and when my mum came home, I asked her why she left the radio on. She said that she hadn't, so we just talked it up to my sister. The second time was a few days later, so I asked my sister why she kept turning the radio on so loud. She looked at me as if I grew a second head and asked me what I was talking about. I explained what had happened, and she told me that it wasn't her, and I told her that Mum said it wasn't her either. This went on for a little while too. Every time all of us were out of the house at the same time, one of us would come back to the radio being turned on. It was pretty funny in a are we all having the same hallucination kind of way, but still kind of creepy too. But one night, we were all in our respective rooms and it happened. The radio turned on. It was blasting the spa music, louder than it had ever been before. We all came out and looked at each other down the hall, and my mum went downstairs and turned off the radio. She came back up the stairs and asked us if that really happened. My sister and I simply nodded our heads, and my mum, practically gleeful, starts saying that we can't be crazy because that definitely happened. I still want to hold on to the shared hallucination theory at this point. I'm already scared of the dark. I don't need another thing to be afraid of, right? But after some more discussion about how weird this was and that we were glad that we weren't just playing a prank on each other, we went back to our rooms to go to sleep. The last time the radio turned on, I was home alone actually, watching YouTube videos on my laptop when, once again, the radio started blasting so loud my ears were ringing. I called my mum for proof, and this was one of the few times in my life that she actually answered the first time I called her. We couldn't hear each other speak though, so I shouted, "That's too loud, can you turn it down?" And it stopped cold. I asked my mum if she heard that, and she confirmed that it actually happened. Me, being the scaredy baby that I was, started to cry and beg my mum to come home so the ghost wouldn't get me. My mum consoled me and said that if the ghost was still there, that at least it was playing healing music. Mum logic, right? Anyway, the radio never turned on by itself again, and my mother was able to find a new office a few months later. I sometimes wonder, though, if I offended this thing by asking it to turn down the music, so it thought, fine, I'll just leave then or something, and packed itself up and just left. Or if decided it would be more fun to mess with our other appliances and annoy the heck out of me for the rest of my life. I have a lot more stories to share, not just electrical issues too, and these are things my family members have seen in the house, and things my friends have seen or experienced here too. My mum is an energy healer as well as a massage therapist and would take me on ghost hunts with her until the time I was attacked, so I could tell you some of those stories too sometime. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now, but do let me know if you guys would like to hear more. I spent the majority of my youth in a house in CT. Originally, it was a two-family house. One side belonged to my father, and the other side belonged to my grandpa and grandma. My dad's side of the house was set up where walking through the front door you'd be in the kitchen. Immediately to the right side of the door was an L-shaped staircase, and at the bottom of the staircase to the left was a small landing or balcony with a railing. To the right was the living room, and on one wall was a door that led to my brother and I's bedroom, and on the other wall was the door to my dad's bedroom. My grandparents' side of the house was set up so that you would have to walk up a staircase to get to the front door. As soon as you entered, you were in the living room, and about 10 feet from the door was a staircase. Up the stairs to the left was the bathroom, and to the right was a spare room, and a little farther down to the left was my grandparents' bedroom. At the end of the hallway was a door. If you went through the door, you would be at the landing balcony in my dad's side of the house. The layout of the house is pretty important too. So eventually, my grandparents moved out of the house, and that divider door in the hallway was soon ripped down by my dad. Now, here's the thing though. My dad is kind of a piece of work, if I'm being honest. Because of him, that house was full of rage and hatred. He was extremely abusive, both physically and mentally or emotionally, towards myself, my brother, and my grandparents too. The house was always uncomfortable to be in, and there was always just this thick negative energy in the air. My dad started dating a woman named Sharon, and she was really awesome, and my dad wasn't abusive when she was around. She also had a son named Matt. He was super cool. He had lots of friends, and he was popular. He was athletic. He was everything that I wished I was. He was such a good friend to have, and, well, one night, my dad and Sharon go out for dinner. My brother was at my mum's house for the weekend, so me and Matt had the entire house to ourselves. We used to play this really messed up version of hide and seek where if you, the seeker, were close to the hider, that the hider would pop out from wherever you were and scare the crap out of the other person. So I'm standing in the living room that's on my grandparents' side of the house. They don't live in the house anymore, but saying it's their side just makes it easier to describe. I'm counting out loud, and Matt runs away to go and hide. I yell out, ready or not, here I come, and I start looking around for him, and I check the closet really quick. I check the kitchen, but he's not around. I go down to the basement, and while I'm down there checking every nook and cranny, I hear him run down the hallways above me. I dart back upstairs, and I start working my way down the long hallway that connects to the two sides of the house. The light in the hallway is off, but the light in the living room in my dad's side of the house is on, so I can see down the hallway a bit. I start moving my way down the hallway, and I see him poke his head around the corner from the landing above the stairs. I run down the hallway, and as I reach the corner of the wall, I scream, "I found you," and flip on the light. But the landing is empty. There's no Matt. Now, the only way that Matt could have gotten away is by jumping over the railing into the kitchen. I'm a little confused, as I definitely didn't hear a thud from him jumping off the railing, but I don't think much about it, to be honest. I run down to the kitchen, flip on the light, and look high and low. But once again, there's no Matt. At this point, I'm actually starting to get a little weirded out, and I get a bit of an eerie feeling. I slow down a little bit and work my way back up the stairs towards the landing. I get to the top of the stairs, and I figure out that Matt has been in one of the rooms. I start heading towards my bedroom, and I hear a bit of a clicking sound coming from the spare room across the hallway from my grandparents' old bedroom. And at this point, I know that I've got him this time. So I run to the door and grab the handle. I can turn it, but the door won't open. I'm pushing on the door, but it just won't open. It was kind of like Matt was on the other side, holding the door and wouldn't let me in. So I yell out something like, "Matt, I found you, give up." And right after that, the pressure behind the door let up, and I blew right into the room. But again, there was nothing. It was empty, and there was no Matt. And now, I'm beginning to lose my cool a bit. I can tell that something is just very wrong, but I don't know what. Remember, I'm probably around 12 at the time, and instead of logically figuring it out, I just kind of panic. I start yelling out for Matt, "Where are you?" And "This isn't funny, Matt, come out." And I don't get any response. I run to my bedroom and rip open the door, and there's Matt, curled up on the floor at the end of my bed. I said to him, "I think someone's in the house or something, Matt." And he starts yelling at me, "You're not funny, that wasn't funny," and now I'm even more confused. I asked him what wasn't funny, and he goes on to tell me how he hid in the bedroom and he heard me run up to the bedroom door and shut the light off from outside. How I started banging the kitchen door and how he was yelling at me to stop. How he tried to open the door, but I had locked it. How he cried for me to stop and I just kept kicking and banging on the door. But obviously, I hadn't been doing any of that. Strangely, too, I never heard any banging or kicking. We both conclude, though, that someone must be in the house with us, and so we call 911. We run outside and hang out by the basketball hoop until the police show up. A cop asks us what happened, and we tell them what happened to both of us. Another cop goes into the house and looks around. They're asking where our parents are, and all we can tell them is that they're out on a date, but we don't know where. I'll tell you too that cop was really nice to us. I remember to this day just how kind he was to us, and after about 10 minutes, the other cop came out and told us that he didn't find anyone. I remember they kept asking us over and over if we were positive that anything actually happened. They had figured that we must have been pulling a prank or something. 2 kids standing outside in the cold, crying her eyes out because of a prank. Right. Well, the officer stayed at the house until our parents got back a little while later. They explained what happened, and my dad was not happy. And he kicked my butt pretty bad that night after Sharon and Matt went home. There was a lot of other stuff that happened in that house too, but the phantom in the hallway and the person behind the door were the scariest and most memorable. At the end of the day, I suppose it's possible that maybe I was just seeing things and maybe it was just a stuck door. I'm really not sure. But back then, I was pretty sure of what I saw, and I still am to this day. I continue to believe to this day too that there's something in that house. Also, I used to sleepwalk sometimes down to the end of our long driveway, almost like something was helping me get out of the house. Make of this what you will, but this is my story and I stand by it as being factual and accurate. And I hope you guys enjoyed. This happened to me 3 years ago in the summer of 2016. It was a usual day for me, spent behind my computer, listening to music and just playing games. I was playing Skyrim with music playing in the background on YouTube. I was done with a quest and I didn't know what to do next in the game, when suddenly my music stopped. And while there was only the sound of my small table fan blowing air, children playing in front of my apartment and the cars on the streets, in between all of those sounds I heard what sounded like heavy breathing. I didn't get scared at the time, I just thought that the autoplay on YouTube put some creepy ambience music on or something. But I didn't have time to alt-tab to change the music because there was nothing to change, and the music kept playing. But then I heard the heavy breathing in the 5-second time window that you have until the next video gets played. And at this point, I freaked out a bit. We lived in a small apartment 2nd floor, and I knew for a fact that I was home alone. My mum left to go to a friend's house, and we were the only 2 people living there. So I took down my headset, and I heard it. The heavy breathing, along with my table fan. And the breathing wasn't like heavy breathing after being scared or after running out of breath or something. I can't properly actually describe it because it sounded like normal breathing, but each breath took a little effort to take. But at this point, I'm sitting there scared in my chair, holding my headset and not moving for like 5 minutes. When I get scared, I tend to freeze. The breathing wasn't coming closer, but it was fairly loud. And after 5 minutes of just sitting there, scared to death, I decided to take out a small pocket knife that I have in the drawer that I got from my dad. It's a really short knife, but it was the best thing that I had at the moment. I braced myself, rapidly stood up and turned around, and from my room, you can see through to the kitchen to the living room, and there was nothing there. But I could still hear the breathing. After standing up, I realized that I heard only the breathing and the fan blowing at this point. The kids outside of my apartment were quiet now and not yelling anymore, and I didn't hear any cars passing on the road. At that moment, I didn't go to check out the window because I had other things on my mind, so I turned off the fan in case that was somehow making the sound. But that was a real bad idea. I was terrified at that point, but when the soothing sound of the air being blown stopped, I could hear only the breathing, and I froze again for like 5 minutes. My only option was to go and check out where the breathing was coming from. When I stepped closer towards the kitchen and the door, it got louder. The breathing had already felt really close to me because it was pretty loud, so I took another and another step, and in the middle of the kitchen, I heard the breathing like it was right next to me. It was the weirdest thing, but I eventually got to the open door sill to the living room, and when I heard it, right behind the corner, as intense and as heavy as breathing could get, like 5 inches from me to the left, behind the corner, was that thing, that person that was breathing really heavily. And so, I braced myself, ready to take on this intruder, and the second that I stepped over the door sill, the breathing just stopped. The kids were screaming and playing again, and I could hear the cars passing by once more. I stood there for a little while, just really confused and really freaked out, but after a bit I called my mum with tears in my eyes to just come home. And that was the first and last time that I ever heard that breathing. This has been the only time that I was truly in danger. I was around 6 years old. My family and I were just leaving the supermarket. I was begging my mum for some candy or something, and by the time that we left, I didn't get any, so I threw a huge fit. I started stomping and crying at the exit and threatened my mum that I wouldn't leave without getting the candy. She said, "Fine, then stay here," and left at the exit. This obviously made me cry and scream even louder. As she was getting closer to the car, a man approached me though. He looked at me and he just said these simple words, "Get in my van, boy, we'll catch her." And at this point, I stopped crying immediately, as I knew what stranger danger was by then, and I just looked at the guy and knew that something bad was going to happen. My mum, seeing this though, quickly rushes back, grabs my hand and yanks me away. She didn't say a word to the man, but she gave him a death glare. And needless to say, I was quiet the whole ride back home. I'm really not sure what would have happened if my mum decided to pack the groceries before she came back to get me from my little fit. I know that this is short, but I still remember those words, all these years later. So, if I recall this correctly, I think this happened in my early teens. I was 13 at the time, I'd guess, around 2009. And I was really low due to issues with my dad. I would constantly listen to heavy metal, and at one point wore Slipknot shirts with pentagrams on them. Edgy teen, right? My room would be decorated with my art, and admittedly I had a large painting of a demon that I personally painted. So I hope this gives you the picture that's needed for this story. Fast forward a year into this, and my mother is trying to help me get through an emotional illness, telling me to dress in brighter clothing and to listen to different music and to get rid of my very dark decorations. By dark, I mean demon decor and pentagram shirts and whatnot. I was a skeptic at the time, still am, but I used to be stubborn and even more reluctant to believe. And she would yell at me saying, "If you keep doing things like this, you'll attract negative energies to our home, or worse, entities." I usually would just dismiss this as my mother not wanting me to be how I was and a metalhead teen, but that would soon change. So it was about 2 months later when the first encounter happened. I was sitting in the living room of the apartment that we lived in, and these apartments had these sliding doors right in the living rooms, which led to small back porches. My computer was situated next to the sliding door, so 14-year-old me was sitting by the door and the couch was just to the left of me. As my mother watched television, the sliding door was propped open because my brothers had gone out for the day and it was a regular dry and windless day in Arizona, when all of a sudden the window blinds just swung inwards wildly, as if a big gust of wind had blown them. I got up and looked and closed the sliding door, not thinking much of it, even though there was no wind, but my mother had noticed and said, "Did you see that? That was not wind. I'm sitting right next to the door and I didn't feel any wind." She dismissed it soon though too, but she was still highly suspicious. But this was definitely not the only thing. Fast forward another week later, and me and my family are in the dining area situated next to the living room, and the kitchen, as it was a small apartment. But for context, the kitchen is a small hallway space consisting of the stove, fridge, sink, and a small pantry with a sliding door. So, we're eating dinner when, all of a sudden, the pantry door falls down and hits the kitchen countertop. Now, me not wanting to give my mother the satisfaction of agreeing that this might be supernatural, chalked it up to just a coincidence, thinking that the door just broke and the wheel on it broke off the track. But when I went to set the door back up, I found the door intact and the wheel was just fine, which means that in order for it to fall, someone would have to pull the small wheel down to unhinge it from the track. I must admit too that this had me slightly scared, but I didn't say anything. Fast forward now to the night of the same day, and we were already in bed when I heard my mother scream. I was so startled that I ran into her room and asked what was wrong, and she explained that she had covered herself in a blanket to cover up from the cold when she felt the sheets tighten around her legs, and she felt as if a pair of hands were grabbing at her legs. I guess at this point that anyone would have started to believe something was up, but again, not me. I was stubborn, skeptical, and again I just chalked it up to her tossing and turning in her sleep, making the sheets tighten. And so I quickly went back to bed, ignoring my mother's pleas to toss my demon memorabilia and pentagram shirts and whatnot. Fast forward 3 days now, and I'd been in my room all day, sick from school, and had been bragging to my mother that nothing had occurred so far and how she was just overreacting, when the television turned itself on to our dismay on full blast. I quickly turned it off, quite startled by this, but said nothing as my mother yelled, "See, it's that stuff and your mental attitude attracting these bad things to our home. You need to get rid of it." I blew her off though, still refusing to believe. But as I went back into my room and went to bed, secretly, I was beginning to get pretty scared. Fast forward one day, and I'd been having a good day as far as living with mental illness went, and I'd eaten 2 whole pizzas and had the feeling that I needed to take a massive dump, so I went to the bathroom. Now, my bathroom is set up like this. You enter, and next to the door is the light switch. Then the sink is there, which is about 2.5 feet long, so it's quite a reach for the light switch. I was sitting on the toilet doing my thing when the lights just all turned off. And at first I thought the lights had gone out until I heard a deep and gravelly voice chuckle and say, "You're mine." And this was definitely the last straw. I quickly tidied myself up and ran out of the bathroom. I told my mother what had happened, and a week later I threw out all of my pentagrams and Ouija board, as well as my big 4-foot demon painting that I made, and we threw it all out and had a cleansing of our home, and the activity subsided about a month later. So I'm currently in my village for vacation. My village has around 200 residents, so it's pretty much a small village. And recently, a kid was actually found dead in a field next to the church. And being a village of mostly religious people, word spread quickly that a mysterious creature of the devil did this thing to this kid. But that's important for later, but for now I have to note that our house was broken into last year, and after that my grandfather installed an alarm with a motion sensor on our porch. It works only at night, and you actually can't disable it. It rings for about 15 seconds, and then it stops until it detects motion again. You might be thinking that this is a problem for our neighbors, but the nearest house is like 100 yards away, and the man who owns it is not even there at the moment. I have to note too that we also have a flickering light open on our porch pretty much always. The light is old, and that's why it's flickering. So, here's what happened. Last night it was really windy, and we have some plastic chairs on our porch so we can sit whenever we want to drink our coffee watching the sunset and whatnot. And these chairs would very rarely trigger the sensor. It was annoying at times, but not enough for me to remove the chairs. So I woke up to the alarm at around 3 o'clock. I just thought it would go away, but whenever it stopped, it instantly started again, and I thought to myself that that's odd, as I stood up to go and check out what was happening. Only a wall separates the kitchen from the porch, so if you look out of the kitchen window, you can pretty much see the whole thing. I opened the blinds and just saw the flickering light and the chair moving, so I assumed that it must have just been the chair. But boy, I couldn't be more wrong about that one. I turned around to go back to my bed when I heard a really weird noise. It was not humanoid, but another noise that an animal would make. None that I know of, anyway. The closest sound that I can compare it to is kind of like one of the monsters from the movie A Quiet Place. Obviously, I froze. I hadn't closed the blinds yet, too, and I then realized that the alarm had stopped and the light had stopped flickering and was just closed at this point. I faced the window again and then it happened. The light opened and revealed this thing. It was greyish with huge teeth and what looked like claws. It stood on 2 feet and had red eyes. And then the thing let out just an ear-piercing scream, and after that, the light flickered again, and by the time it came back on, it had disappeared. The alarm started ringing again, and I called my mother and told her everything, and that I had to leave. She didn't believe me, and had the audacity to actually ask me if I had been drinking anything that night. I hadn't. I was completely sober. Everyone now thinks that I'm crazy too, and I don't actually tell this story anymore just because I'm afraid of what other people will say. All I know is that I know what I saw. It was 100% real, and it was the scariest thing that I've ever witnessed. I don't know how this kid was killed, but now I think that this thing may have had something to do with it. So a few important things before I tell my story. 1, my kitchen has a big window next to a door, and at the right side, through the window, you can look at our backyard. It doesn't have a curtain. I always sit at our dinner table to work on school things and stuff which is placed in front of the large window too. Number 2, we also have 2 dogs, a Shih Tzu, a Maltese mix. They're very sweet, but they bark a lot when they hear something outside of our house. 3, when this happened, I was home alone with my little brother, 13. And 4, my neighbors have a cat that walks around our house a lot. And with that said, here's the story. So a few months ago, my parents decided to go on a little holiday together for 2 days. My brother and I were fine with being home alone, and we didn't want our grandparents to babysit us. My parents agreed, and they left that Saturday morning. That whole day was just normal, everything went like it usually does, and when it was about 11:30 p.m, my brother and I went upstairs to sleep. I put out the lights and locked the windows and the doors, and everything still seemed usual. But at about 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of my dogs loudly barking. They do this pretty often because of the neighbor's cat walking around their house, and I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. Usually the dogs stop barking in about 5 minutes, but this time they didn't. I thought that this was pretty weird, so I got out of bed and checked on my brother. He was still asleep, so I decided not to wake him up, and I just walked downstairs myself. I went downstairs, and my dogs were barking towards the large kitchen window, which wasn't that weird since the cat walks in our garden a lot too. I put a light on and walked around the kitchen to see if something was off. Everything seemed fine though, and I then checked if maybe my dogs were in pain or something, but they weren't. So I then looked outside to see if the cat was walking around, and the cat was nowhere to be seen. I must admit too that this made me feel really uneasy. And after this, I didn't really feel like sleeping anymore, so I sat down at the dinner table to watch some YouTube and just chill out for a bit. After like 10 minutes, I started to feel uneasy again, and I had this weird feeling of just being watched from the window. I decided at some point that it was better to just shut the lights off and go back upstairs. Because I didn't feel safe though, I grabbed a kitchen knife to protect myself if anything was about to happen. When I got upstairs, I checked my brother again, and he was still safe and fast asleep. I sat down in a hallway so I could hear the things downstairs better. And after a while, my dog started barking again. At this point, I was actually pretty fearful, so I decided to call the police and then walk downstairs. The police told me that they would be here in about 15 minutes. I walked downstairs as silently as I could, and when I got into our hallway downstairs, I noticed that the light by our front door was on. This only goes on when people walk by, but I was stupid and shrugged it off as just being the neighbor's cat walking by again. When I got back into the kitchen, my dogs were still barking. So I turned the lights on and sat down again. And not even a minute after I sat down, I noticed movement in our garden behind the large window. I just froze, and I honestly couldn't move. My dogs started barking like crazy because they could see the movement too. And it was a pretty large person moving slowly towards the door. I still had the knife, but I'm 15 and quite small. The person looked a lot larger than me, and I surely wasn't about to win against him. He also had to have seen me too, because he started moving faster towards the door. Fortunately, at this point, the police arrived and they knocked on the front door. I sprinted towards the door and let them in, and the man probably ran away because when the police investigated the backyard, he was gone. But later, with the help of a police dog, the man was arrested and charged for attempted burglary. He apparently was arrested a few years ago too because of an attempted assault. My brother and I didn't get hurt and everything turned out fine, but I still am too scared to stay home alone these days. Last week, after a bizarre dream, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time. I woke up scared, paralyzed, and staring straight at what appeared to be a shadow person that looked like it had been standing over me while I was asleep. Last night, my fiancé told me about something that I did in my sleep that creeped me out even more than any of that. So when I woke up this morning, my hands and the muscles in my forearms were really sore. My fiancé had gotten up before me and was sitting in the kitchen on his laptop. I started making coffee, and how sore my hands were was really starting to bother me, so I mentioned it out loud. My fiancé turns out to look at me, and he looks a little confused and worried. He asks if I remember getting up last night, and I don't. I don't remember waking up at all. My fiancé is a sleep talker or walker, and will get out of bed and leave the room if I let him. I routinely have to get him back into bed as he tries to sleepwalk out of the room at night. Thankfully, he normally talks a lot when he sleepwalks, and this wakes me up so that I can stop him before he gets out of the room. I, on the other hand, have never to my knowledge sleptwalk in my entire life. My fiancé has told me in the past that I do sleep talk sometimes, but normally he can't understand what I'm saying because I'm whispering or that I don't say anything at all. I just laugh for a few seconds and then I get quiet again. So after I confirm that I do not remember waking up, he tells me that not only did I wake up, I also got out of bed. He says that he woke up because the bed was shaking. He sat up in bed and I was standing at the foot of the bed, gripping the footboard. He said every few seconds I would jerk on the footboard, and it somehow managed to drag the whole king-sized bed with him in it, like 2 feet away from the wall. He was able to get me to let go of the footboard and get me to go back to bed. He said that the entire time I never said a word, but my eyes were wide open, and that I was looking right at him while he was talking. I honestly don't remember any of this, and I'm not sure if this is paranormal or something else, but it really creeped me out, especially since I've been having these sleep paralysis moments lately. Hopefully this is the end of it, but somehow I don't think it is. I've been having a lot of what I believe to be paranormal activity in the apartment that myself and my boyfriend moved into about 6 months ago. The first month or so after moving in, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I started to notice little things like cupboards being open that I know were closed, some with doors, and I even heard footsteps shuffling across the floor in the next room, candles always being blown out when I'd leave a room, shadows moving across the wall, or dark figures out of the corner of my eye even. And then it progressively got worse as well. But one night, my boyfriend and I were upstairs talking with our landlord who lived there. I was telling him about some of the things that had been going on while my boyfriend, the non-believer, just rolled his eyes. Our landlord wanted to come down into the apartment to look at a few things in the kitchen anyway. We all came down and every single cupboard was wide open. After assuring my boyfriend that it wasn't me playing a prank, he got pretty freaked out and went back upstairs. My landlord and I continued talking when we both heard a deep growling coming from the area of my closet in the bedroom. But we were about 10 feet from the bedroom, and he just said, "Nope," and went back upstairs. He's refused to talk about it since then. I still get chills thinking about it too. Another night, I was laying in bed trying to sleep, eyes closed but very much awake. and I felt my boyfriend sit on the bed, so I opened my eyes and looked at him. He was just silently laughing at me and shaking a closed fist to my face, which was really weird. I sat up and asked him, "What the heck are you doing? Leave me alone." I'm pregnant, so I was getting pretty grumpy easily at the time. I asked him the same thing again, and when he didn't answer and he just smirked at me with his fist in the air, I grabbed my pillow and rolled over to the other side of the bed, laid there for about 30 seconds, but still felt the need to yap at him some more. I was pretty ticked off. He knew I was sick and needed rest, so I got up and went into the living room and asked him what his problem was, and he had no idea what I was talking about. I thought he might have been screwing with me, but after seeing how visibly shaken I was and not being the type to intentionally scare me, I believe it wasn't actually him that I saw. He made me a little snack and put me back to bed and laid with me until I fell asleep. But I woke up not long after because my bedroom doorknob was being turned back and forth very rapid and really loudly. I sat up and looked at the door and it stopped. 100% freaked out but tired, I went back to sleep. And then it happens again. I popped up and actually saw it go back and forth this time a few times before it stopped as well. I got up and swung the door open and no one was there. Boyfriend was outside smoking and I was alone in the apartment. In the weeks following, I'd feel my wrist get grabbed or my leg too. I'd feel what felt like the bed being compressed as if someone was crawling across it, but I was alone. And one evening, I heard footsteps in the kitchen, so I went to investigate. I stood in the doorway and they stopped. A few seconds later, and the top of one of the roses popped off and flew a few feet. And at that point, I noped out of there pretty quick and went into my bedroom to text my boyfriend to get his ass home. The longer I sat alone, too, the more uneasy I became, so I said screw it, went into the kitchen to make something to eat, threw all the lights on, TV on for noise, and I felt better, I must admit. As I was cooking, I began to feel really lightheaded, though. Everything started going black, so I went as fast as I could towards the couch, and I just collapsed onto it as I blacked out. Now, I've never blacked out or fainted in my life, and when I sat back up, all my candles were blown out, and there were leaves from my roses just scattered everywhere. Recently, too, I went out with friends and my boyfriend kept texting me asking when I was coming home. I thought that was pretty cute and that he was missing me, so I finally get home and he looked really spooked. He said that all night he was hearing footsteps, doors closing, door handles turning, and even saw a human-like shadow move across the wall. And guess who's a believer now, whether he wanted to or not. Since these incidents, many of the small things continue to occur, but I haven't experienced anything evil in a little while, thankfully. Knock on wood though, right? I've had other paranormal encounters in my life, much less creepy when my family member and my best friend after she passed, but this feels evil. If it starts up again, we've already agreed that we're going to move. Our son is due at the end of July, so there's not a chance that we'll stay if the evil presents itself again. But I am wondering if we should just move anyway. Better to be safe than sorry, right? What's your opinion on what I'm dealing with here? A few years back, one of my best friends and business partner was and still is a single dad. His ex-wife was, unfortunately, in and out of mental institution for years, and he had sole custody of his two kids, a boy 10 and a girl 14. My friend had to travel to New York to oversee the multimedia setup for the auto show for the Ford display, and I was back at the office with the programmers during the day and would stay with the kids each evening. Their house was a new 2-story rental in the woodlands of Texas. The development was built in a heavily wooded area just north of Houston for anyone interested. Now, weird stuff started happening the very first night that I was there. I was watching TV with the kids, the den lights would go off, and the light switch was on the other side of the room, which was weird. I went over and the switch was turned off. I thought it was a problem with the breaker or there was another light switch or something, but if there is another switch, who turned that one off then? I flipped the switch on either way, and the lights came back on, and I went back to sit down. The lights went off again, and I walked back, and I found the switch flipped back down to off. And that really disturbed me. But this went on for a while. I asked the kids if this had happened before, and they told me every now and then the lights would go off. So now I'm trying to act unconcerned in front of the kids. Suddenly, though, there was a loud crash in the attic. We went upstairs and opened the attic door to check, and there was nothing in the attic. It was completely empty, and there was no explanation for what made the loud noise. At this point, I'm thinking there's somebody else in the house. I mean, there has to be, right? Their mother had actually showed up unexpectedly before at their old house, but she was in jail at the time and supposedly didn't even know this address. Things quieted down, and it was eventually time to go to bed, though. I let the family dog in, a lab, checked all the doors and made sure that they were locked, and then went up to the guest room, which was between the kids' bedrooms. I left my door cracked, and I just turned the bedside lamp off, and I was laying down, and I saw the silhouette of a boy crouched between the cable box, the VCR, where the lights are on the other side of the room, and myself. I thought the sun was getting ready to try and scare me or something, so I turned the bedside lamp on and said, "Gotcha," but when I did, there was nobody there. And then there was another loud crash in the attic. This woke the kids up too, and now they were really scared. We then heard a door slam downstairs, and I told them that it was a new house and, well, noises happen. I also told them that I would sleep in the daybed out in the hallway. I made my rounds again and, well, all went back to bed. When I woke up the next morning, the kids and the dog were all asleep on the floor next to my bed, and I still had 4 more days to go. So the next day I got to the house as it was getting dark. The wind was starting to pick up and all of the tree limbs were swaying. There was thunder in the distance, but the kids seemed pretty fine, and I helped them with their homework, made dinner, told them no, that we're not going to McDonald's again, and we all finally sat down to watch some TV. The storm was worsening, and there was more thunder and lightning now too. So the den in the house was huge, with large floor-to-ceiling windows, and the walls went all the way to the rafters. There was an interior balcony on the second floor that wrapped around 3 of the walls. There was an exterior balcony facing the backyard. You could see through the upper windows out to the lower part of the outside balcony. And now, the rain was just coming down in sheets. The wind is blowing and there's bursts of lightning, and suddenly, the daughter says that she sees something moving out on the balcony. I look up and it looks like a pair of legs in dark pants scurries past one of the windows. So I'm thinking, do I get a gun out of the master bedroom? But that opens a whole new can of worms. So I run back up the stairs from the kitchen to the second floor hallway and out through the balcony door. The wind is blowing cold rain right into me and I get soaked, and I also don't see anyone on the balcony. I go back upstairs and tell them that there's no one outside. Shortly thereafter, I tell them it's time for bed as well. The son goes right to bed and goes to sleep. The daughter is afraid of storms, though, and the dog won't go into her bedroom, and her cat is nowhere to be found. I tell her that I'll sit with her until she goes to sleep, and I bring a chair into the bedroom and set it on the left side of her bed. We talk about storms, and I tell her about being in a tent in the army during really bad storms and how nice it is to be in a house for this storm. And eventually, we both fall asleep. There's a loud clap of thunder and a flash of lightning, and I wake up and I see a dark figure, about 5 feet tall, standing in the far corner of a room. I jump to my feet, but now I don't see anything. I don't want to wake her up, and I carefully walk around her room and check the hallway. I slowly sit back down, really confused, and I eventually just doze off again. Later, I hear a noise, though, and I startlingly looked around. The cat is curled up on the foot of her bed, and the dog is starting to lay down at my feet. The storm has passed now, and looking outside her bedroom window, stars are shining up above the tree line. I go to lay down in the daybed, out in the hallway again, and just as I fall asleep, I hear a door downstairs slam shut. It kinda sounds like the kitchen door to the garage, maybe. I go downstairs. The kitchen door and the door to the garage and the front door are all shut and locked. So I start to walk over to the master bedroom suite, but something just tells me not to go there. So I head back upstairs and lay back down, and what seems like seconds later, the alarm goes off and it's time to start a new day. I have to get breakfast going, and then it's my turn to drive school carpool. My friend was due back late on Saturday from the airport. I was ready to head back to my house, where I also took care of my dad. My dad had been having some health issues and whatnot, and we, the interactive media company, had to get several laptops with updated programs on them sent out via FedEx for tomorrow delivery to the Ford Auto show booth. I dropped those off at the FedEx counter at the IAH cargo area, and I then drove up north on the I-45 to the house. We stayed up late, but everything seemed quiet this night. I had taken to sleeping in the daybed in the hallway on the second floor where the kids' bedrooms were, and after the kids finally went to sleep, I checked all the doors again and turned out most of the lights and went back up to the daybed to go to sleep. However, the family lab just wouldn't come upstairs though, and there was no sign of the cat again. The hallway was partially lit from the kitchen light coming up from the back stairs just off to the left, and the glass door out to the balcony at the other end of the hall. On the opposing end of the hall, there were 3 steps leading up to the girls' bedroom. Both kids had their doors shut, and I was sound asleep when I just had this feeling that someone was in the hallway with us. I sat up in bed and was startled to see a young boy standing in the hallway. Except he wasn't really standing. He was kind of hovering about 1 foot off the floor. He seemed to be lit slightly from within, and he kind of gave off a dim glow, and he was clearly visible in the darkened hallway. He was looking directly down at me, with his head tilted slightly downward. He had a blank neutral expression on his face, and he looked to be about 12 years old, had blonde hair with freckles, but with large dark eyes. He was wearing a well-worn pair of coveralls and a faded yellow shirt. His clothes were faded, well-worn but clean. He was barefoot, and his feet pointed downwards towards the floor. His arms hung down by his sides. I asked him in a low voice, "What do you want?" And after saying those words, he started immediately drifting slowly toward the stairwell. He kept looking at me, but he didn't blink his eyes or change his expression. He rotated slightly to the right as he floated towards the stairway to keep facing me. His faint glow cast a small amount of light on the surrounding walls, floor and ceiling. He then floated out of view, and I could still see his glow on the far wall of the stairwell and could see it moving downwards following the stair steps. I sat there for a few moments with my heart racing, and the glow faded along the wall, and he should have been down to the landing on the stairs by then, and I went to look down the stairway, and he was gone. And a few moments later, I heard a loud slam of a door on the ground level near the master bedroom on the other side of the house. I didn't really sleep that night, and I woke up the next morning and did my duties, and I haven't been back to that house since then. My whole life I've had weird experiences, and that's how I categorize them too. Weird. Not abruptly paranormal, but just strange. There's some quick background too about me to give some fleshed out characterization as to what I'm about to share. I'm a male in my 30s from New Zealand. I don't suffer from any psychological or mental issues, or none that I'm aware of anyway. I grew up in a distinctly lowerish middle-class family in the suburbs over the tracks, and I have a healthy appetite for logical thinking, and most of my experiences I have some sort of logical explanation as to why it happened, but some are still just weird. And so, here's some of my stories. So at about age 5 to 6 was my first weird experience. I remember I was young because I was either at the end of my time at kindergarten or just beginning primary school. I had been asleep for a while when I felt fingers touch the right side of my neck where the jugular vein is. The fingers were distinctly female fingers too, but old and wrinkly, like my grandmother's. I remember being calm because since I was waking up out of my sleep and feeling female fingers, I guess because I equated male fingers to being rough and large like my dad's, I assumed that they were just my mother's. It wasn't until I opened my eyes to a dark room with no one else in there that I started to really feel terrified. I rolled over, threw the sheets over my head, forced my eyes shut, and fell back asleep terrified. Now, This could easily have been some sort of sleep paralysis, but to this day, as a grown-ass man, I still can't sleep without the bedsheets over my neck. At about age 7-ish to 9 too, I would have shadows taunt me from my bedroom doorframe in the shapes of cartoon characters. I've only experienced shadow people once in my life, and I'll get to that later, but this was different from that and from what I've read as well. My bedroom was connected to a hallway, which was also connected to our lounge. So, lounge, hallway, and then bedroom, with my doorframe adjacent to the doorframe that led into the lounge. I mention this too because the lounge area of the house has a lot of windows that let in a lot of ambient light at night. I would wake up in the middle of the night, have no idea why I just woke up, and see a dark shadowy figure slightly poke their head up or upper body out from behind the doorframe, so it was like that they were standing in the hallway. I'm not sure why I thought that they were taunting or goading me, because all they ever did was poke some body part out from the doorframe, and once they noticed that I was awake watching them, they'd keep doing it, almost like they knew that they were keeping me up, terrified so that I couldn't sleep. Some nights I'd have the shadowy silhouettes of Big Bird and Fozzie Bear, and other nights it would be Scooby-Doo or Barney the Dinosaur. Full disclosure too, I didn't watch Barney the Dinosaur myself, but it was on in the background if I was being looked after with my little cousin after school. This continued for a couple of years, and I guess it just kind of stopped. I will still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and check the doorframe for shadows, but I haven't experienced it since I was a kid. Again, this is most likely just sleep paralysis, but has anyone else experienced this kind of thing before? At age 9 and 10, my mother had a handful of jobs growing up. One job that she had was a caregiver for an elderly couple who lived just across the road from us. The couple got along well with my family, so some weekends my mother and father would go to their house to do odd jobs. One such Saturday, my mother, father and sister had gone across the road and left me by myself at home to play Aero the Acrobat on Sega in the lounge. Only a few minutes after everyone else had left was when I felt an incredible sense of dread and panic just come across me. It felt like someone was behind me, and I could feel the anger and the hate coming off of them, and it was directed towards me. I was sat there frozen with fear, and in that time I decided that if I sat upright and bolted straight to the sliding door to my right in one motion, that I could make it down the driveway and across the road to my family before something bad happened to me. And so, that's what I did. I bolted for the door and made it out of the house, and I was just too scared to look back. As soon as I reached the road, though, I instantly felt like an idiot. Why am I running away from a feeling? It was a terrifying feeling, but it was just a feeling. But I kept running as a sprint until I got to my mum doing gardening, and that's where I stayed until everyone went back home. That one I can't quite explain, other than a kid home alone had an active over-imagination, but I do distinctly remember that feeling of anger and hate, and I've not felt something like that since then. At age 10 and 11, my parents decided to renovate the house, and they started with their bedroom first. All of their stuff, including their bed, was in the lounge opposite my room. So I wake up late at night, really needing to take a leak. I get up, get to the doorway of my bedroom, and make direct eye contact with this doll that my mum has. It's not a typical porcelain doll, but it's close enough with a frilly dress, a bonnet, and a music box built into it. This doll doesn't scare me in the least, as much as it should have, I guess, but it just never did. My sister always hated it, though, and it always gave her the creeps. But as soon as my foot hits the hallway and my eyes make contact with the doll's eyes, I, clear as day, hear my full name whispered by a female voice in my right ear from behind me. I'm in the hallway. I can hear my mother and father snoring because their bed is in the lounge, and my sister definitely is not behind me and very rarely ever has said my full name. And so, I just turn back around and jump back into bed with the sheets over my head, deciding that I don't really need to take a leak after all. I tell my mum the next morning, and she just kind of laughs and says that I was probably imagining things. I never told my sister that story until a few years ago, and she's adamant that it definitely wasn't her as well. It's very possible that it was an auditory hallucination, but still, it was weird. Age 14 now, and I was enjoying a good book on the toilet like any kid in the early 2000s would at around 9 or 10 p.m. I noticed something from my peripheral vision above my book, which was on the floor beneath the door, which looked to be some kind of twine that I could swear wasn't there when I sat down on the toilet, and most certainly moved slightly when I saw it after looking up from my book. Strange, but doesn't really register enough to pull me from my book. As I open the door after I finish up, I see the piece of twine disappear from beneath the door, and that's when I see down the hallway what looks like a big black mass bounding. The size of a house cat maybe, but the shape of a ball that's kind of frizzy. It bounds off the wall around ankle height, back into the carpet and on the floor, and takes a hard down to the hallway into the kitchen. I stand in the hallway, just kind of stunned. I have no idea what I saw, but have no pets, and it made no sound or impact or weight as it bounded down the hallway away from me. I meekly made my way to my bedroom, which is right beside the bathroom, closed my bedroom door, and I'm pretty sure that I slept with my lights on that night. Could have been a giant rat, I know, but again, no sound, and it just wasn't the right shape. Age 15 now, and this is my one and proper shadow person story. So it was a Saturday night, and my parents had gone out late to do something, so they wouldn't be home until much later that night, and my sister was out that night as well, so I had the whole house to myself. And what does a 15-year-old do with the house to himself on a Saturday night? Why, he makes a massive pot of cheese pasta, drinks some of his dad's alcoholic cider, and listens to Led Zeppelin, which he just discovered a few months ago and is really feeling right now. Pasta on lap, cider in hand, and Babe I'm Gonna Leave You blaring on the family sound system. I sit down to enjoy myself when I see to my right, not a few feet away from where I'm sitting, a giant tall black figure. Whatever this is, it's tall and just a solid black shape of a man. I look at it for a few seconds from a right-hand angle, and I'm not too scared. If anything, I kind of feel serene and calm, which was really weird. I look away for barely a second, and it's gone. I'm still feeling calm, but after a few minutes, I start to feel uneasy after figuring what I just saw wasn't a normal thing. I turned on all the lights on in the house and finished my pasta and cider and waited for my parents to get back home. From the age of 15 to at least my mid-20s, nothing really interesting happens, nothing that I can remember anyway. I mostly live my life without anything weird happening. Age 25 comes around though, and at this point in my life, my girlfriend and I have just moved into a new house. It's cold and damp in the winter and has a weird layout, but it suits us and allows us to have our dog, so we're happy. I'm home alone after work, and I'm just sprawled out on the bed, still in my work clothes, on my phone, when I hear a male voice call out from the front of the house. Me, thinking that it's either the landlord or my father, I call back in response. But nothing. Thinking to myself, that's weird. I get up and check, since if someone was at the front door of the house, I'd be able to clearly see them, since our driveway is pretty long. So if someone was at the front of the house and had left, by the time that I got up, I would have plenty of time to still see them go down the driveway. But, as you probably suspected, there was no one there. And the weirder thing still is that my dog doesn't seem excited or distracted, like he normally is if someone was at the front of the house. I end up chalking that one to a weird noise or just an auditory hallucination again. Age 28, and my girlfriend and I have moved again, this time to a house that's not cold and damp during the winter and doesn't have a weird layout. After a few days of unpacking, we're finally settled in, and the first thing she wants to do is take a hot bath, since our last place had a bathtub so big the hot water would run out by the time the water reached your ankle in the tub. That evening, it was also my turn to cook dinner. So, her in the bathtub and me in the kitchen, with the dog sniffing around my feet, trying to see if I would drop any scraps for him. Out of nowhere, the dog runs out into the lounge from the kitchen, and I hear my dad laugh this distinctive laugh, which I've heard for my entire 20-plus year life. This is weird because I'm not expecting my dad at all, and weirder yet, I didn't even hear him come in the door, and it's not like him at all to not knock before he comes into the house. Even if he didn't knock too, the sliding door for the front patio was closed, and that makes a loud noise when opened. I call out to say something like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting you," but there's nothing. I walk into the lounge and no one's there. The dog is sitting on the couch, girlfriend still in the bathtub, and no one in sight. Again, too, this house, like the last house, there's only one way to the front, so if anyone was around, I could have clearly seen them. But again, there's no one, and I clearly heard my dad laugh. I get a little freaked out by this and text both my dad and my sister about what just happened. I text my sister telling her that I know it sounds stupid, but can she text Dad too? Something just feels weird. 5 minutes later, Dad texts back saying that what just happened was strange, but he never came around and he's at home having dinner with Mum. I know that I heard my dad laugh though, and then I think back to that one time when I thought I heard someone at the old house and how I thought that could have been my dad too. Again, I chalk this up to just a bizarre auditory hallucination, but this time, I'm a little less self-convincing because I know what I heard. A few months after that, I had a dream where I woke up because I had heard my dad fall over and call out for help. I didn't see this in my dream, I just heard it. The sound of a person falling over in a really bad way and my dad calling out for help. This one was just a dream, but it was weird and kind of surreal, so it stayed with me for a few days. On the Saturday of the week of the dream, my dad and I were in a car, and the first thing I mention is this dream. He kind of laughs nervously and then tells me that the same day he had a dream about my grandmother who passed away a few years ago. And in this dream, she too had fallen over and was calling out for him to help her. And that one I can't really explain. I've asked my parents if they've ever experienced anything paranormal or weird in the family home, but all I got was laughs and a solid round of no. My sister currently lives in our family home, and I've talked to her about my experiences. My niece sleeps in my old bedroom, and my sister swears that she's always gotten a really weird and creepy vibe whenever she's putting away my niece's clothes or is cleaning up in there. I'm mostly sharing these stories with you all because, well, I enjoy hearing them myself, and I guess that I would like to get some feedback too. But if you guys have any input or advice, I would love to hear it. Thanks for listening. So, when I was little, my stepdad used to work the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, in a nice part of town off the highway before you head up to the Sierra Nevadas and Lake Tahoe. But the area back then was fairly new, and the Shell gas station was really nice. My stepdad never had any problems working the night shift, though he did tell me some interesting characters would come in, and he often had regulars that he became friends with too. My stepdad was the only one in the shop when he worked the night shift, and he always told about the ghosts that liked to pester the other workers, like turn off lights, open or close the bathroom door, knock snacks off the shelf, the works. My stepdad, being the massive skeptic as he is, didn't believe any of these stories, and because nothing ever happened to him personally, he just kind of brushed them off. Until one night. So my stepdad is working on the night shifts, and it's a pretty quiet night. He hasn't had many customers coming through other than for gas, and since it's a pay at the pump station, hardly anyone comes into the store anyway. So, my stepdad is playing on his phone and frequently glances up at the doors or at the security monitor to see if anyone's coming, but the station is deserted. He turns his attention back to his game when he hears the electronic sliding doors open and the sound of the bell above the door goes off. My stepdad puts his phone down and looks up to greet the customer, but he doesn't see anyone. He calls out, but no one answers. He glances at the security camera, but doesn't see anyone else in the shop except him, and there are no cars at the station or in the parking lot. He obviously gets a little bit weirded out by this, since the doors have sensors, and the only time that they open is if they sense someone approaching them. But he just chalks it up to a prank or some sort of malfunction and gets back to his game. But then he hears hello, and he hears the voice as clear as day right in front of him, and his head immediately snaps up to speak to the customer he clearly didn't see before. But there's no one there. He's even more weirded out, but convinces himself that he was either imagining things or that the sound somehow came from his phone or the radio. And then he hears the screams. He said that the sound of a woman screaming just came out of nowhere, and they were so loud and so chilling that he jumped and dropped his phone. My stepdad is actually a pretty big guy, about 6'2" and a little hefty, and he doesn't normally get scared over pretty much anything. But he said that the screaming terrified him so much that he couldn't really think straight. He ran out from behind the counter and checked the aisles, but no one was there. He checked the bathrooms and the maintenance closet, and no one was in there either. But the screams were still going, and they were still definitely loud. So he thinks maybe there's a woman outside who might be hurt or being attacked or something. He runs outside to where he thinks the screaming woman is, and there's no one there either. The lot is just completely empty. There are no people, no cars, and nothing. He checks around the back of the store and does a loop, but he can't find the source of the screaming, and just as suddenly as the screaming had started, it stopped. He goes back inside and checks the security tapes to see if he's missing anything, but other than him running inside and outside of the store like an idiot, he doesn't see anything else, and he's unsure of what to think. The next day, as he's leaving work and his co-worker takes over, he tells him about what happened, brushing it off as just some weird prank that some little turd did. But the co-worker's response was very, very different. And even though my stepdad doesn't believe in any sort of paranormal activity, the words have always stuck with him. The guy said, "Oh, so you've heard her too." Growing up, my stepdad moved around a bit when his dad was still in the Air Force, and eventually his dad got out and they settled down in a small town in South Dakota called Underwood. Now, Underwood today is still pretty small with nothing to do in it, but back in the late 80s to mid-90s or so, there was even less to do. From my understanding, when my stepdad told me this, Underwood was mostly houses and land, and there was also a few small shops and I think a liquor store in town. He said that unless you wanted to drive the hour or so to get to Rapid City, the most fun kids had those days were drinking, driving around late at night, or parking way out in the land to drink and smoke. So, not a whole lot of action. But one night, when my stepdad was a teenager, he and a couple of his friends decided to go out to a reservoir somewhere on the outskirts of town. They parked on a dirt path with their car facing the pool of water. Beyond the water was a stretch of trees, and beyond the trees was a chain-link fence that enclosed the area. After the chain-link fence was another dirt road that led out. He said that he remembered it being warm out that night, with no clouds in the sky, and since town was miles away, the stars and the moon were bright enough to light up the area, just enough so that they could make out their surroundings and see each other. So, my stepdad and his friends are sitting outside the car, drinking and just shooting the breeze, when they notice something weird. There's a light. Now, the light is moving along the fence, sweeping back and forth, and at first the guys think that it's a cop car coming along to see who was trespassing. But there's a few problems with that idea. One, there's only one source of light, and two, the light isn't being broken up. What that means is that the light should be on the outside of the fence and broken up as it passes by. And because of the fence and the trees along the fence, the light should have disappeared behind the trees and then reappeared when it passed the trees. But the light was solid, and it stayed solid the entire time it went by. So my stepdad and his friends are trying to figure out what the hell that thing is, and then one of them points out that the light isn't even on or near the ground. It's floating maybe about waist height. But because there was a lake of water between them, it was hard to tell how high up from the ground it actually was. They thought that maybe it could be a person with a flashlight, but the way the orb of light moved and how it looked was just completely different from that of someone holding a flashlight up. And though they were far away from the light, they couldn't make out any shadows of a person holding it. My stepdad and his friends watched the light for a few more moments until it just disappeared without any warning. Feeling unsettled, they decided to leave and just go somewhere else to drink. They obviously didn't tell anyone what they saw, since they were breaking quite a few laws that night, and they never went back there to drink again. And to this day, my stepdad has no idea what it was. He's a pretty big skeptic, and regardless of all the weird things that have happened to him, and he has a few other stories to tell, he doesn't believe in the paranormal and always tries to come up with plausible excuses for what it could have been. But this one, he's always said that he just can't quite explain. So, what are your thoughts?